I am Byron, 68 years old, and I recently learned that the most dangerous predators do not hide in the shadows. They sleep down the hall. I spent my life building a commercial logistics empire from absolute nothing, but my most profound lesson in ruthlessness came from my own son. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire reality overnight, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your intelligence. The screen of my phone pierced the absolute darkness of my bedroom. The digital clock on the nightstand read exactly 2:50 in the morning. I stared at the harsh blue light, reading the text message from my son, Brandon. We have discussed this extensively. We need distance from you. Your presence in the house is causing too much stress for our marriage. Please stop contacting us. We need our own space to grow. I read the words twice. I did not type a response. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and stood up. A sharp, familiar ache flared in my knees. It was a permanent physical reminder of the 40 years I spent manually loading heavy freight trucks on the graveyard shift before I ever bought my first fleet of commercial rigs. I had broken my body to ensure Brandon would never have to lift anything heavier than a pen. I dressed in complete silence. I slipped into a tailored suit, refusing to face whatever waited for me downstairs, looking like a broken old man. I secured my watch and prepared to confront the entitlement I had accidentally nurtured. I walked down the sweeping mahogany staircase of the estate. The foyer was flooded with harsh, artificial light. Courtney, my daughter-in-law, stood perfectly still in the center of the imported Italian marble floor. She was completely dressed in a designer pantsuit, looking as though she were preparing for a midday corporate luncheon rather than an eviction in the dead of night. 2 large canvas duffel bags sat near the front door. I watched her pull a heavy plastic zip tie tight across the zippers of my luggage, sealing my personal belongings with clinical precision. She looked up and met my gaze without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. "Brandon is upstairs in the master suite," Courtney stated. Her voice was flat, entirely devoid of any warmth or humanity. "He cannot look at you right now because his anxiety is simply too high. We hired a private car for you. It is idling at the bottom of the driveway to take you to a downtown hotel. You hover over us constantly. You critique how I manage the household staff. You judge Brandon when he makes executive decisions for his software company. This is our home now. You are an immense burden to our marriage, and we need you to leave our property immediately." She stepped back from the bags and crossed her arms, waiting for me to break down or raise my voice. She expected tears. She expected a plea for forgiveness from a lonely widower desperate to stay near his only child. She was entirely unprepared for my silent acceptance of her cruelty. I studied her defensive posture, noting how tightly she gripped her expensive phone. She truly believed she held all the power in this house. I did not argue. I did not demand to see my son. I looked around the vast foyer I had paid for in cash a decade ago. I had moved into the guest wing of this very house 3 years prior when Brandon's startup began hemorrhaging money. I quietly absorbed the massive property taxes. I paid the exorbitant utility bills under his name to help rebuild his shattered credit score. I funded their private chef and their endless luxury vacations to keep up their wealthy appearances among their high society friends. "Is this your absolute final decision?" I asked. My tone remained completely neutral, offering absolutely no emotion for her to feed on. "It is the only decision we are willing to make," Courtney answered, lifting her chin with profound arrogance. "We are claiming our independence. Do not cause a pathetic scene, Byron. Just take your bags and get in the waiting car." I did not say another word. I walked past her, picked up the heavy canvas duffel bags, and pushed open the massive oak front doors. The freezing night air hit my face, shocking my senses awake. I walked down the long, winding driveway toward the idling black sedan. The gravel crunched under my dress shoes. I placed my bags into the trunk, climbed into the back seat, and instructed the driver to take me to the financial district. I did not look back at the mansion. I did not mourn the loss of my bedroom. I only felt a cold, calculated anticipation for the reality check they were about to face. They demanded independence. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for in its purest, most brutal form. As the car rolled smoothly past the towering iron gates of the estate, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my secure, encrypted banking application. I navigated straight to the automated corporate transfers menu. I bypassed the standard checking accounts and accessed the private wealth management portal. I scrolled down until I located the active recurring transaction. It was a $15,000 bi-weekly direct deposit feeding directly into Brandon and Courtney's joint checking account. They believed this money was the natural revenue from Brandon's failing software firm. They believed their lavish lifestyle was entirely self-sustaining because I had engineered the deposits to look like anonymous corporate dividends. I tapped the glowing screen. I canceled the pending transfer immediately. I did not stop there. I deleted the routing profile permanently, ensuring no future funds could ever bridge the gap between my accounts and theirs. The financial safety net I had maintained for years vanished into the digital void with a single swipe of my finger. I locked the screen and leaned my head back against the cool leather seat of the car. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I felt an overwhelming wave of absolute clarity wash over me. The era of my unconditional financial salvation was officially over. I closed my eyes and waited for the morning, knowing the silence I was leaving behind would soon turn into utter chaos. They had severed the emotional ties. I had just severed the financial arteries. The collision course was set. I knew Courtney would be heading to the spa tomorrow. I knew Brandon had a massive payroll deadline approaching on Friday. They were about to discover how quickly a mansion turns into a prison when the invisible landlord stops paying the wardens. The sun rose over the city skyline, casting harsh geometric shadows across the modest downtown hotel suite I had secured for the night. I sat at a small glass table near the window, drinking a cup of bitter black coffee. The silence of the room was a stark contrast to the sprawling, echo-filled mansion I had left behind. I did not feel the exhaustion that usually accompanies a sleepless night. I felt a sharp, singular focus. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, my phone began to vibrate aggressively against the glass tabletop. The caller identification flashed Brandon's name. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, ensuring my voice carried no trace of emotion. Brandon sounded entirely frantic, his breath hitching as he spoke at a rapid, panicked pace. He demanded to know what was wrong with the primary banking systems. Courtney was currently standing at the reception desk of a high-end luxury spa across town, completely humiliated. Her premium corporate credit card had been declined twice for a $400 facial treatment. She had tried to use the backup accounts only to find them completely frozen. Brandon insisted that there was a massive bank error that needed my immediate authorization to fix. He ordered me to call the wealth management branch and bypass the security holds so his wife could leave the spa without causing a public scene. He spoke to me not as a father, but as a negligent employee who had forgotten to file a routine piece of paperwork. He fully expected me to apologize for the inconvenience and instantly restore their access to my capital. He had absolutely no idea that the foundational structure of his entire reality had already been completely dismantled. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee before responding to his frantic demands. I calmly reminded my adult son of the exact text message he had sent me at 2:50 in the morning. I recited his words verbatim, reminding him that he and his wife had explicitly demanded distance from my presence. I told him I was simply respecting the strict boundaries they had established when they packed my bags and ordered me out of the house. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line as the reality of my statement began to register in his mind. The arrogance instantly vanished from Brandon's voice, replaced by a raw, primal panic. He abandoned his complaints about Courtney's spa appointment and pivoted directly to his own survival. He admitted that his software company possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. He confessed that without my bi-weekly $15,000 direct deposit, he could not cover his corporate payroll on Friday. He pleaded with me, claiming his lead developers would walk out and his entire server infrastructure would be shut down by the end of the week if the funds did not clear immediately. I remembered buying Brandon his first computer in the 90s, working double shifts at the freight yard to ensure he had the technological tools I never possessed. I had funded his education and his business dreams, hoping to forge a man of absolute integrity. Instead, I had financed a man of profound entitlement. I told him that my money had left the property at the exact moment I did. I advised him to manage his own corporate crisis without my assistance. I hung up the phone and turned the cellular device completely off, silencing his panic. I dressed in a sharp charcoal suit and took a cab directly to the towering glass building that housed my legal team. Bradley, my lead corporate attorney, met me in his private corner office overlooking the financial district. Bradley had managed my holding company's legal perimeter since my commercial trucking fleet expanded across state lines 2 decades ago. He was a ruthless, brilliant tactician who understood the exact weight of my directives without needing emotional context. I sat in the leather chair opposite his desk and gave him a concise, objective summary of the night's events. I instructed Bradley to sever every remaining financial tie connecting my wealth to their lifestyle. He pulled up the master trust profiles on his dual monitors. Bradley analyzed the incoming data and offered a stern professional warning. He stated that cutting off the secondary business credit lines would trigger a cascading default for Brandon's software firm. The company would be utterly bankrupt by Monday morning, and Brandon's personal assets would be targeted and seized to cover his outstanding vendor liabilities. Bradley asked me to explicitly confirm the directive, knowing it would permanently ruin my son's professional reputation and expose him to immediate civil litigation. I did not flinch. I told Bradley to execute a total asset freeze on all cards, accounts, and credit lines bearing Brandon's name. I authorized the immediate revocation of his status as a dependent beneficiary under my corporate umbrella. I watched Bradley type the final override codes into his secure terminal. With a few decisive keystrokes, the secondary safety nets were completely eradicated. Brandon was now completely exposed to the harsh economic realities he had avoided his entire adult life. While processing the final account closures, Bradley suddenly stopped typing and leaned closer to his primary monitor. A high-priority notification had just flashed across the screen from the Municipal Property Registry network. Bradley alerted me that a new, highly irregular digital footprint had emerged originating from my estate address. Desperate to generate fast cash after the sudden freezing of his accounts, Brandon was actively attempting to list the mansion's massive guesthouse for rent on multiple luxury real estate platforms. He was demanding a massive upfront cash deposit from potential tenants to cover his looming corporate payroll. Bradley turned his screen to show me the fraudulent listing, complete with fresh photographs of the guesthouse interior. Brandon operated under the arrogant assumption that he held the legal deed to the estate simply because he lived there. He failed to comprehend the intricate legal architecture I had established years ago. I had purposely placed the minor municipal utility bills in Brandon's name to help build his personal credit score when his business initially faltered. Courtney and Brandon foolishly mistook their names on a water bill for legitimate legal ownership of a multi-million-dollar property. Brandon was now publicly soliciting renters for a guest house that belonged exclusively to my commercial real estate trust. Bradley immediately reached for his phone to draft an aggressive cease and desist order to the online platforms to block the illegal listing. I raised my hand and instructed Bradley to stop. I told him not to block the rental advertisement. I realized Brandon's utter ignorance of property law presented a flawless opportunity. I decided to let my son sign a binding fraudulent lease agreement with an unsuspecting tenant to trap him in a criminal offense. I leaned over the polished mahogany desk in Bradley's office to examine the high-resolution monitor. Brandon had uploaded a meticulously detailed rental listing for the estate's guest house on an exclusive short-term luxury leasing platform. He was aggressively demanding an exorbitant sum of $12,000 a month alongside an immediate $24,000 cash security deposit. The arrogance of his digital advertisement was astounding. He blatantly advertised the property as a private annex of his personal estate, complete with unauthorized access to the main mansion's heated pool and tennis courts. Bradley's fingers hovered intensely over his keyboard, ready to draft a severe legal cease and desist order to strike the fraudulent listing from the internet before any damage could occur. I raised my hand and instructed my attorney to stop his typing immediately. I told Bradley to let the advertisement remain active and entirely uncontested. Bradley looked at me with profound professional confusion, warning me that allowing an illegal rental agreement on corporate trust property could invite massive civil liability. I completely ignored his legal caution. I wanted my son to find a wealthy, eager tenant. I wanted Brandon to sit across a table and confidently sign his name on a legally binding commercial lease agreement for a physical property he did not possess. I knew that issuing a simple warning letter would merely force Brandon to look for another illicit method to generate his missing payroll funds. Allowing him to execute a fraudulent residential contract would actively trap him in a severe documented crime. I told Bradley to monitor the listing's status code and notify me the exact second the status changed from active to leased. We sat in silence and watched the digital trap open its jaws. I sat back in the heavy leather chair and considered the sheer magnitude of my son's legal ignorance. Brandon fundamentally believed he possessed the legal authority to rent out the guest house simply because the monthly utility invoices arrived bearing his name. Several years ago, right after Brandon graduated with a useless business degree and zero practical experience, his personal credit score was entirely abysmal. He could not even secure a basic auto loan without my direct co-signature. To help him establish a reliable financial foundation, I legally transferred the primary water and electricity accounts for the entire estate into his name. I paid those bills myself using automated corporate transfers, allowing Brandon to reap the benefits of a flawless payment history. Courtney and Brandon eventually moved into the main house and saw those utility envelopes arriving every single month. In their extreme entitlement, they foolishly mistook a simple municipal water bill for a legitimate binding property deed. They assumed my quiet financial management meant I had formally surrendered the physical estate to the next generation. They never once bothered to search the county tax registrar or examine the actual ownership documents filed at the courthouse. They simply equated their luxurious residency with absolute ownership. I had spent decades navigating brutal commercial zoning laws, fighting racist banking practices in the 80s, just to secure loans for my first 3 delivery trucks. I knew the devastating power of immaculate paperwork. My son, however, had spent his entire adult life clicking buttons on a screen and expecting the physical world to instantly obey his commands. He was about to learn a spectacular lesson in real estate law. The trap snapped shut early Thursday morning. Bradley called me just before 9 o'clock to confirm the luxury listing had been officially marked as rented on the platform. Brandon had successfully secured a wealthy, unsuspecting tech executive relocating from the coast who needed immediate temporary housing. Through our continued monitoring of the platform's public ledger, we confirmed Brandon had aggressively collected a massive $36,000 initial cashier's check to cover the first month and the security deposit. My son then confidently signed a formal standardized residential lease agreement, brazenly listing himself as the sole proprietary owner and executive landlord of the guest house. Bradley immediately intercepted a digital copy of the executed contract from the public registry database. He printed the pristine document and slid it across his desk for my careful review. I stared at Brandon's messy signature on the bottom line. He had sealed his own fate for a quick influx of cash to save his failing software company. I did not hesitate for a single second. I instructed Bradley to compile a comprehensive fraud packet containing the forged lease, the authentic corporate trust deed proving my exclusive ownership, and the canceled banking transfers. I authorized my attorney to forward the entire dossier directly to the State Commercial Housing Authority and the Financial Crimes Division of the local police department. I demanded they pursue the matter as an urgent case of high-level real estate fraud in progress. I sat in Bradley's office drinking another cup of bitter black coffee, watching the digital confirmation receipts arrive from the authorities. The invisible gears of the legal system began to turn with ruthless, unstoppable efficiency. The consequences arrived at the estate just before noon. I monitored the live feed from my hidden perimeter security cameras on my tablet. 2 marked police cruisers and a dark sedan belonging to the Housing Authority investigators rolled up the long gravel driveway. They bypassed the main house entirely and parked directly in front of the guest house. The prospective tenant was already there, attempting to unload designer luggage from a moving van. Brandon marched out of the mansion's front doors wearing a sharp business suit, completely unaware of the impending disaster. He approached the officers with a confident, arrogant stride, assuming they were simply there to investigate a neighborhood alarm. I watched the lead investigator hand Brandon the printed dossier. The audio feed captured the investigator explicitly confronting my son for executing a deeply illegal commercial lease on a property registered exclusively to a protected corporate holding trust. Brandon's confident posture shattered instantly, his face drained of color as the officers demanded to see his non-existent property deed. The wealthy tenant realized immediately that he had been entirely scammed. He dropped his luggage on the grass and furiously demanded his $36,000 back in cash on the spot. Courtney stepped out onto the porch, clutching her silk robe, watching her husband stammer and fail to produce a single piece of valid legal documentation. Brandon was caught holding stolen cash, standing on land he did not own, facing severe criminal charges for grand larceny by deception. He looked around wildly for the financial safety net I usually provided. For the first time in his pampered life, Brandon was staring directly into the abyss of a severe legal crisis with absolutely no one coming to save him. I watched the high-definition security feed on my tablet as the confrontation unfolded on the mansion's front lawn. The lead police officer did not negotiate with my son. He firmly ordered Brandon to return the $36,000 cashier's check immediately or face a swift arrest for grand larceny by deception. Brandon's shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He pulled the heavy envelope from his tailored suit pocket and handed it back to the furious tech executive. The prospective tenant snatched his money, hurled a string of colorful insults at my son, and ordered his moving van to drive away immediately. The immediate criminal threat was neutralized, but the financial punishment was just beginning. The investigator from the State Commercial Housing Authority stepped forward with a thick citation pad. He handed Brandon a formal notice of violation, slapping him with a devastating $50,000 civil penalty for executing a fraudulent commercial lease. Courtney stood frozen on the manicured grass, clutching her silk robe tightly against the harsh afternoon wind. Her eyes darted from the severe citation in her husband's shaking hand to the towering columns of the estate she truly thought she owned. The illusion of her supreme wealth evaporated completely in that single devastating moment. She finally realized the municipal utility bills they had paid meant absolutely nothing. Her husband did not own the mansion. He did not own the guest house. He was simply an unauthorized occupant facing massive municipal fines. The police cruisers and the investigator's sedan rolled down the driveway, leaving Brandon and Courtney entirely alone with their self-inflicted disaster. Less than 5 minutes after the authorities departed, my phone began to vibrate aggressively on Bradley's desk. Brandon was calling. I answered the call and placed the device on speakerphone so my attorney could properly document the conversation. Brandon did not offer a standard greeting. He unleashed a blind, screaming rage, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his sudden public humiliation. He violently accused me of setting a malicious trap, claiming I intentionally weaponized the police and the municipal authorities to destroy his life. I let him yell until his voice completely gave out. I did not raise my voice in return. I coldly informed my son that his profound ignorance of basic commercial property law was a personal failure, not a conspiracy. I told him that assuming ownership of a $10 million corporate trust property based on a simple municipal water bill was a staggering display of executive incompetence. I reminded him that I had never once claimed to have transferred the property deed to his name. He chose to forge a legal document to steal money from an innocent party on his own accord. I then delivered a final calculated blow to his shattered ego. I informed Brandon that since he had proven his capacity to generate rental agreements, he could now experience the strict obligations of a tenant. I stated that a formal lease for his continued occupation of the main house would be drafted by my legal team today. I reminded him that his first month's rent of $20,000 was due promptly on the first of the month. I hung up the phone before he could formulate a response, leaving him to process a new insurmountable debt. The crushing reality of the impending housing authority fines and the completely unfunded corporate payroll sent Courtney into a state of absolute terror. She knew Brandon's software company would inevitably collapse by Friday, dragging their personal assets down with it. Desperate to find any source of immediate liquid capital, she began a frantic, destructive search of the mansion. She bypassed the empty guest rooms and the stripped home offices, eventually making her way down to the sub-level storage corridors. She stopped in front of the heavy steel door securing my private basement vault. She used a heavy brass fire poker from the living room to violently smash the electronic keypad, forcing the internal locking mechanism to disengage. Courtney stepped into the climate-controlled sanctuary I had carefully maintained for over 2 decades. She ignored my personal logistics files and went directly for the curated valuables lining the far wall. She discovered my extensive private collection of rare African-American art and original pressings of vintage jazz vinyl records. I had spent 30 years acquiring these specific pieces directly from brilliant independent creators during my cross-country freight routes in the 80s and 90s. They were priceless cultural artifacts representing the vibrant soul of a community and the quiet reward of my lifelong labor. Courtney did not seek cultural history or personal sentiment when she looked at the canvases. She only saw an immediate financial solution to her husband's total ruin. She grabbed 4 original canvas paintings and 2 protective cases holding incredibly rare signed vinyl albums. She calculated their immense worth strictly in terms of how many days of luxury they could buy her. Courtney carried the stolen artwork and the vintage records up the basement stairs with careless, desperate haste. She loaded the fragile canvases and the protective vinyl cases into the back of her luxury SUV, brutally scratching a custom mahogany frame against the heavy trunk latch in the process. She planned to drive directly to a high-end auction house located in the city's affluent arts district. She fully intended to pawn my curated collection for a massive fraction of its actual worth, hoping a quick cash sale would cover the municipal fines and keep Brandon's business afloat for 1 more week. She slammed the trunk shut and rushed to the driver's seat, completely unaware of the digital security infrastructure I had woven into every single inch of the estate. Sitting in Bradley's office, I felt a sharp, continuous vibration from my mobile device. I opened my security application and saw a flashing red alert. The silent alarm tied to the basement vault's biometric keypad had been triggered by a violent physical breach. I tapped the notification and accessed the hidden camera feed positioned inside the vault ceiling. The high-definition playback showed Courtney smashing the keypad and stripping the walls of my most valuable assets. She had escalated from emotional entitlement to outright criminal burglary. She assumed the physical distance I granted them meant I was entirely blind to their actions. Bradley noticed the severe shift in my posture and asked if Brandon had retaliated. I showed my attorney the live feed of Courtney speeding out of the estate gates with my life's collection in her vehicle. The next phase of their self-destruction was already in motion. I sat in the leather chair across from Bradley and expanded the security application on my tablet to full screen. The high-definition camera mounted inside the climate-controlled basement vault provided a perfect view of my daughter-in-law actively ransacking my cultural sanctuary. Courtney carelessly tossed the final original canvas into the back of her luxury vehicle, severely scraping the custom mahogany frame against the metal trunk latch. She slammed the heavy tailgate shut and rushed to the driver's seat. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I had personally cataloged every single item in that vault over the past 3 decades. I had acquired those specific pieces directly from brilliant independent artists during my initial cross-country freight routes in the 1980s. I knew the precise market value and provenance of every brushstroke and vinyl groove she had just stolen. I did not call the local police to report a standard domestic burglary. I opened a separate encrypted application linked directly to the National Art Registry. I possessed the certified appraisal documents and the unique serial identifiers for the stolen canvases and the rare signed albums. I meticulously entered the specific registry numbers into the federal stolen property database. I flagged the entire stolen collection with an absolute priority alert. Any licensed appraiser or legitimate art dealer running a basic background check on those pieces would instantly trigger a silent law enforcement protocol. Bradley watched me type the final security keystroke. He noted that Courtney was driving straight into a federal trap. I locked my tablet and placed it on his desk. I told my attorney that she had chosen to operate like a common thief, so she would now be treated exactly like one. Courtney navigated her SUV through the heavy afternoon traffic and pulled into the loading bay of a prestigious auction house located in the affluent arts district of the city. She believed her expensive designer clothing and her proximity to my wealth granted her absolute immunity from standard security protocols. She marched into the pristine lobby carrying 2 of the stolen canvases and a protective case containing the vintage vinyl records. She approached the front desk and aggressively demanded an immediate cash appraisal from the senior gallery director. She fabricated a desperate lie claiming she was acting as an official agent for my estate and required an expedited private sale to liquidate the assets for a luxury home renovation. The senior appraiser maintained a polite professional demeanor while carefully inspecting the physical condition of the artwork. He recognized the profound cultural significance of the original pieces immediately. He requested a moment to verify the provenance records in his back office. Courtney tapped her manicured fingers on the glass counter, impatiently demanding he bypass the formalities and simply issue a cashier's check. The appraiser retreated to his secure terminal and inputted the unique artist signatures and the visible serial numbers into the Global Art Registry network. The system instantly flashed a severe red warning indicating the items were actively reported as stolen property. Following strict federal guidelines for handling stolen cultural artifacts, the appraiser did not alert Courtney to the discrepancy. He pressed a discreet panic button located beneath his desk. He returned to the lobby with a calm smile, assuring Courtney that the authentication process would only take a few more minutes. Courtney crossed her arms and waited, completely unaware that she had just locked herself inside a rapidly closing cage. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 unmarked vehicles abruptly blocked the main entrance of the auction house. 4 plainclothes detectives from the Financial Crimes and Art Theft Division entered the lobby with swift, coordinated precision. They bypassed the receptionist and moved directly toward Courtney. The lead detective instructed her to step away from the canvases and requested her formal identification. Courtney's arrogant posture evaporated instantly. She clutched her designer handbag and demanded to know why she was being interrogated in a public setting. The detective bluntly informed her that she was currently attempting to fence federally registered stolen property. 2 officers physically separated her from the artwork and detained her in a small private viewing room adjacent to the lobby. The reality of her criminal exposure crashed down upon her. Courtney began to hyperventilate, her carefully constructed high society persona shattering completely. She frantically attempted to leverage my name to escape the immediate legal consequences. She aggressively insisted that the artwork belonged entirely to her father-in-law. She fabricated a wild story swearing to the detectives that I had given her explicit verbal permission to transport and sell the collection on my behalf to cover unexpected family expenses. The lead detective listened to her desperate excuses with total professional skepticism. He informed her that verbal permission holds absolutely zero legal weight when dealing with registered high-value cultural assets flagged in a federal database. He stated that unless the registered owner could immediately corroborate her story, she would be placed in handcuffs, transported to the precinct, and formally charged with grand larceny and the attempted sale of stolen goods. Courtney sobbed uncontrollably, begging the officers to make a simple phone call to clear up the massive misunderstanding. The lead detective pulled my contact information from the Federal Registry file and initiated a formally recorded phone call. I answered the call while sitting securely in Bradley's office. The detective identified himself and asked if I had authorized my daughter-in-law to liquidate my private art collection. I spoke with absolute clarity and cold precision. I stated unequivocally that I gave no such permission to Courtney or to any other member of my family. I informed the detective that my private basement vault had been breached violently, and the valuable items were removed without my knowledge or consent. The detective thanked me for the swift verification and ended the call. He returned to the private viewing room and delivered my statement directly to Courtney. She collapsed into a chair, finally realizing her father-in-law had completely abandoned her to the justice system. The detectives prepared to place her under formal arrest. Desperate to avoid a highly public perp walk and a permanent felony record, Courtney begged for lenience. Because she had not successfully completed the financial transaction and the physical property remained undamaged, the authorities offered her a harsh ultimatum. She surrendered the artwork completely to police custody and signed a formal written statement admitting to a severe domestic misunderstanding regarding estate assets. She avoided immediate jail time but effectively cemented a police record of her attempted theft. The detectives released her from the viewing room. Courtney walked out of the luxury auction house completely humiliated, her social reputation destroyed, and her pockets entirely empty. She climbed back into her vehicle with absolutely no cash to save her husband's collapsing software company. Furious and cornered by his wife's public humiliation, Brandon launched a vicious and unhinged retaliation plan to destroy my character permanently. The news of Courtney surrendering to the authorities at the auction house reached my son before she even returned to the mansion. Driven by absolute desperation and the sheer public humiliation of his wife, Brandon decided to launch a vicious counterattack on the one battleground he understood best. He took to his massive social media platforms to orchestrate a highly coordinated defamation campaign against my character. Brandon recorded several emotionally manipulative videos from the grand foyer of the estate, standing deliberately in front of empty walls where my art collection once hung. He stared directly into his phone camera with perfectly manufactured tears in his eyes, telling his thousands of followers that I was suffering from severe, untreated dementia. He spun a deeply tragic narrative claiming I was aggressively hoarding the family wealth and actively terrorizing the very people who were desperately trying to care for my failing mind. He painted a picture of a paranoid, abusive old man who was violently dismantling his own legacy out of sheer cognitive decline. His followers immediately rallied to his defense, flooding the comment sections with messages of profound sympathy and intense outrage directed at me. Brandon weaponized the internet to destroy my public reputation, hoping the sheer volume of public pressure would force me into a defensive retreat. He fully expected me to release a public statement or engage in a pathetic digital shouting match to clear my name. He wanted me to fight his virtual war on his preferred digital territory. He assumed that the threat of public disgrace would force me to unlock the bank accounts and surrender my autonomy just to make the viral videos stop. He fundamentally misunderstood the type of man he was attempting to destroy. I did not build a nationwide commercial logistics empire by caring about the loud, uneducated opinions of complete strangers. In the early 1980s, when I first attempted to expand my independent trucking fleet, I faced extreme and relentless banking discrimination. Loan officers would look at a young African-American man requesting commercial capital and immediately throw my applications directly into the trash without a second glance. I learned very quickly that public perception and social grace meant absolutely nothing in the ruthless machinery of the corporate business world. I overcame that systemic prejudice by becoming entirely undeniable on paper. I maintained immaculate cash-heavy ledgers and built an airtight financial architecture that no discriminatory bank manager could ever legally deny. I learned to completely ignore the deafening noise of public opinion and focus entirely on the silent, undeniable power of a flawless paper trail. Brandon believed his viral videos held actual power because they generated immediate digital sympathy and thousands of meaningless likes. I knew that digital sympathy could not pay a commercial mortgage or satisfy a corporate payroll ledger. I did not download the applications he used to broadcast his elaborate lies. I did not read a single comment from his outraged supporters. I remained in the quiet sanctuary of Bradley's office, preparing a far more devastating and permanent response. While he fought for public approval, I fought for total legal dominion. I knew that when the federal authorities eventually looked at our lives, they would not evaluate our social media presence. They would examine our accounting software. I left the public theater entirely to my son and focused my energy on the concrete foundation of his remaining livelihood. Brandon currently served as the chief executive officer of a mid-sized logistics brokerage, which operated as a heavily subsidized subsidiary of my primary holding company. I had originally funded this brokerage 5 years ago to give him a prestigious title and a controlled environment to learn the family business. Since I maintained total executive authority over the parent trust, I possessed the unilateral legal right to examine every single financial transaction that occurred within his subsidiary. I bypassed our standard corporate accounting department and hired an independent, highly specialized forensic accountant known for destroying fraudulent enterprises. I instructed this specialist to conduct a ruthless, microscopic audit of Brandon's entire operational history. I demanded a line-by-line examination of his vendor contracts, his executive expense reports, and his international wire transfers. The forensic auditor sequestered himself in a secure conference room for 3 uninterrupted days, tearing apart the digital fabric of my son's corporate leadership. I paid the auditor a premium to leave absolutely no stone unturned and to trace every single dollar that had entered or exited that brokerage over the past 36 months. While Brandon continued to post tearful updates about my supposed mental decline to his followers, the auditor quietly unearthed the undeniable proof of his criminal financial desperation. The loud public narrative was completely irrelevant compared to the silent, undeniable numbers hiding within the secure corporate servers. I waited patiently for the final report, knowing that the forensic analysis would provide the exact ammunition required to permanently dismantle my son's professional career. The forensic auditor presented his final dossier to Bradley and me early on a Tuesday morning, laying bare a staggering level of corporate theft. The financial discrepancies were absolutely massive and entirely intentional. The auditor discovered that Brandon had been utilizing a digital copy of an incredibly old, legally revoked power of attorney document to bypass standard banking security protocols. He had weaponized this outdated authorization to illegally funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars in corporate operational funds directly into his personal checking accounts. He was actively bleeding his own subsidiary dry to maintain the lavish lifestyle he and Courtney demanded. Brandon was not just an incompetent businessman running a failing startup. He was an active embezzler facing severe federal exposure and immediate corporate termination. Unaware that I now possessed the absolute proof of his corporate theft, Brandon decided to escalate his attack to the corporate boardroom. Bolstered by the overwhelming public support generated by his social media campaign, my son formally scheduled an emergency meeting with the board of directors at the corporate headquarters. He circulated a heavily doctored agenda stating his explicit intention to present his fabricated medical claims to the shareholders. Brandon planned to leverage the viral public outrage to officially declare me medically incompetent and force a board vote to oust me from my own company. He intended to seize total control of the parent trust before his payroll bounced. He arrogantly believed his digital followers had given him the necessary leverage to overthrow the architect of his entire existence. I watched the meeting notification arrive in my inbox, fully prepared to let him walk blindly into an absolute corporate slaughter. Brandon moved with the reckless momentum of a man who believed his own digital lies. He assumed the outdated, digitally scanned copy of his revoked power of attorney still carried absolute legal weight within our complex corporate infrastructure. Blinded by the false validation of his internet followers, my son officially summoned the board of directors to the primary headquarters of our logistics holding company. He bypassed my loyal executive assistants and utilized his subsidiary credentials to reserve the main glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor. His objective was glaringly obvious. He intended to present his fabricated narrative of my severe mental decline directly to the primary shareholders. He planned to formally declare me medically incompetent under corporate bylaws and instantly seize the position of chief executive officer. Brandon desperately needed total control of the parent trust to cover his impending payroll and escape the massive debts he had foolishly accumulated. He spent the entire weekend preparing a sleek, heavily manipulated slide presentation. The slides featured out-of-context financial freezes and selected clips from his viral social media videos, carefully edited to make my strategic silence look like the erratic behavior of a senile old man losing his grip on reality. He thought the board would be easily swayed by a polished presentation and a tragic emotional appeal. He fundamentally misunderstood the ruthless nature of the corporate directors I had handpicked over the last 3 decades. They were individuals who valued profit margins and flawless ledgers above petty family drama. Brandon walked into that building on Thursday morning convinced he was orchestrating a brilliant corporate coup. He was merely organizing the audience for his own professional execution. He believed he was the rightful heir claiming his throne early. He failed to realize that a throne built on forged paperwork collapses under its own weight. Courtney accompanied her husband to the corporate headquarters to perfectly play the role of the exhausted, deeply concerned daughter-in-law. She wore a pristine, sharp white designer suit purchased just hours earlier on a newly opened high-interest credit card. She carried herself with the haughty confidence of a woman who believed she was mere moments away from becoming the undisputed matriarch of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. Before the official meeting commenced, Courtney strategically positioned herself by the catered coffee station in the executive lounge. She intercepted the arriving board members, offering them warm smiles that masked a deeply toxic agenda. She leaned in close to the seasoned executives, whispering insidious lies about my supposed cognitive collapse. She recounted highly exaggerated stories of my sudden departure from the mansion, framing my calculated and quiet eviction as a frightening episode of geriatric wandering. She claimed I was suffering from aggressive paranoia, hallucinating severe financial threats, and recklessly locking vital corporate accounts without understanding the devastating consequences to the business. She played the victim flawlessly, dabbing at her dry eyes and asking for their absolute support during this challenging family transition. She urged the directors to vote in favor of Brandon's emergency motion to protect the company's future from my decaying mind. The board members listened, politely nodding with practiced corporate neutrality. They offered her quiet murmurs of generic sympathy while keeping their personal thoughts entirely concealed behind blank expressions. Courtney interpreted their polite professional silence as absolute agreement. She took her seat beside Brandon at the long mahogany table, crossing her legs and waiting for the gavel to fall, entirely convinced she had successfully poisoned the room against me. She assumed these corporate titans were as easily manipulated as her local country club acquaintances. I arrived at the corporate headquarters exactly 15 minutes after the emergency meeting officially began. I did not alert the lobby receptionist to my presence. I walked through the towering glass atrium alongside Bradley, my stride steady, measured, and devoid of any hesitation. We bypassed the standard security checkpoints using my primary biometric access overrides, which Brandon foolishly believed he had successfully disabled. I approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the main boardroom. Through the transparent acoustic panels, I could see Brandon standing at the front of the room, energetically pointing a laser pointer at a digital projection detailing his proposed corporate restructuring. I gripped the steel handle and pushed open the double doors. The heavy click of the latch echoed like a gunshot through the massive room, instantly silencing my son mid-sentence. The 12 board members turned in their high-backed leather chairs to look at me. I did not yell or demand an explanation. I did not offer a single word of greeting to the room. I maintained a posture of absolute, terrifying authority. I walked slowly down the length of the room, feeling the sudden, suffocating tension drop heavily over Brandon and Courtney. I reached the head of the mahogany table, pulling out the primary executive chair that legally belonged to me. I sat down in total silence. Bradley took the seat immediately to my right, placing his locked leather briefcase on the polished wood surface. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly into my son's terrified eyes. I gestured calmly with my right hand for him to continue his presentation. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted entirely to my command as I sat in absolute stillness. I was ready to watch him dig his own corporate grave. Brandon struggled violently to regain his composure under my unwavering gaze. His voice instantly lost its commanding executive pitch, dropping to a shaky, nervous cadence that betrayed his severe internal panic. He rushed through the final slides of his presentation, stumbling over his fabricated statistics and his heavily edited medical claims. He desperately tried to steer the narrative back to his core objective, insisting that my unexpected and silent appearance in the boardroom was somehow further proof of my erratic, unmanageable behavior. He concluded his disastrous speech by formally projecting the outdated, legally voided copy of his power of attorney onto the main digital screen. He slammed his sweating hands down on the podium and demanded an immediate binding vote from the board of directors. He formally moved to have me declared medically incompetent and immediately removed from my position as the controlling director of the corporate holding trust. He demanded to be instated as the interim chief executive officer to prevent the company from an imminent financial ruin that he had secretly caused himself. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the boardroom. The seasoned directors did not look at Brandon or his desperate wife. They looked entirely at me, waiting for my authorized response to this blatant corporate mutiny. I did not speak a single syllable. I simply turned my head and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to my attorney. Bradley unclasped the heavy brass locks on his leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks sounded like a hammer being pulled back on a loaded weapon. He extracted a thick stack of certified, heavily audited financial documents. He prepared to drop a legal and financial anvil on the table that would instantly and permanently terminate my son's entire career. Bradley stood up from his chair with the deliberate grace of a seasoned executioner. He reached into his open leather briefcase and extracted 12 thick, red-stamped folders. He walked the length of the long mahogany table, placing a certified packet directly in front of each active board member. The sharp sound of crisp paper sliding across polished wood replaced the tense silence in the room. Bradley did not raise his voice, but his words commanded absolute authority. He directed the board to open the first page of their respective packets. He calmly explained that the power of attorney currently projected on the main digital screen by my son was entirely fraudulent. Bradley pressed a button on his remote, projecting the official updated corporate trust charter directly beside Brandon's falsified slide. I had legally voided Brandon's executive authorization exactly 3 years ago. On the very afternoon, he completely mismanaged a critical overseas freight contract and aggressively attempted to cover up his staggering logistical failures. I had quietly restricted his access to protect the holding company, allowing him to retain his title solely for appearances. Brandon stared at the massive digital projection of my authentic signature, permanently stripping him of his power. The undeniable proof of his deceit lay exposed under the harsh fluorescent boardroom lights. The color drained completely from his face. He looked down at his trembling hands, realizing the legal foundation he had built his entire hostile takeover upon was nothing more than an outdated, useless piece of paper. The board members scrutinized the certified documents before them. They cross-referenced the dates and the notarized federal seals. Their polite, neutral expressions dissolved into sharp, calculating glares. They realized immediately that Brandon had brought them into this room under completely false pretenses. The corporate directors recognized a massive liability standing at the podium. Bradley did not give my son a single moment to recover his breath. He instructed the directors to turn to the second section of their folders. He formally introduced the findings of the independent forensic accountant I had hired over the weekend. Bradley systematically laid out the absolute proof of Brandon's severe corporate embezzlement. He read aloud the exact dates and the specific dollar amounts that my son had illegally wired out of the subsidiary operating accounts. He detailed how Brandon had weaponized the outdated, legally voided authorization form to bypass standard banking security protocols and funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into his personal checking accounts. Bradley presented the itemized receipts demonstrating that corporate capital meant for vital logistics infrastructure had been fraudulently diverted to pay for Courtney's luxury spa memberships, designer wardrobes, and massive personal credit card debts. The seasoned executives sitting around the table were genuinely horrified by the sheer scale of the financial exposure. They realized this monumental breach of fiduciary duty threatened the stability of the entire enterprise. These were ruthless individuals who prioritized profit margins and strict legal compliance above all else. They saw the explicit paper trail of a rogue executive bleeding their subsidiary dry to fund a lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. The lead director, a brilliant tactician I had personally mentored 20 years ago, slammed his folder shut in utter disgust. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted from tense confusion to absolute unified outrage. Brandon stammered desperately, trying to formulate a defense, claiming the transfers were simply delayed executive compensation bonuses. Nobody believed a single word. Courtney shrank back into her leather chair, her arrogant high society facade shattering completely under the hostile stares of the most powerful corporate leaders in the city. The trap had closed flawlessly. The lead director did not wait for Brandon to finish his pathetic stammering excuses. He raised his hand, silencing my son instantly, and called for an immediate emergency motion to vote on executive termination. The voting process was lightning fast and entirely unanimous. Every single board member raised their hand to formally terminate Brandon with absolute cause for gross financial misconduct and severe corporate embezzlement. Bradley stood at the head of the table and outlined the immediate devastating consequences of the board's binding decision. He informed Brandon that his tenure as chief executive officer was officially over. He was stripped of his exorbitant salary effective immediately. Bradley demanded the instant surrender of Brandon's corporate access badges, his executive laptop, and the keys to his company-funded luxury vehicle parked in the executive garage below. Furthermore, Bradley announced that the premium corporate health insurance policy covering both Brandon and Courtney was permanently canceled as of midnight tonight. Brandon realized his grand hostile takeover had transformed into a brutal, publicly documented professional execution. The sheer velocity of his total ruin left Brandon completely paralyzed. He turned his desperate, bloodshot eyes toward me. He silently begged me to intervene, hoping the father who had historically caught his every fall would step in and halt the corporate slaughter. I sat perfectly still in my elegant chair at the head of the mahogany table. I offered him absolutely no salvation. I maintained a cold, unwavering gaze, letting him fully absorb the agonizing weight of his own actions. Two large, broad-shouldered corporate security guards stepped silently into the boardroom through the frosted glass doors. They flanked the podium, signaling that the meeting had concluded, and the newly terminated executive was now considered a severe security risk to the building. The security personnel firmly grasped Brandon by his upper arms and physically escorted him away from the podium. Courtney scrambled out of her chair, her face flushed with extreme humiliation, her brand-new designer suit suddenly looking like a terribly cheap costume. The guards marched the disgraced couple out of the glass boardroom, down the high-speed executive elevator, and straight through the crowded, echoing expanse of the main corporate lobby. I stood up and walked to the towering floor-to-ceiling windows on the 50th floor. I looked down at the street level far below. I watched the guards push my son and his wife out through the revolving glass doors onto the cold concrete sidewalk. Brandon looked entirely broken, staring blankly at the busy city traffic, completely stripped of his title, his income, and his unearned prestige. Courtney yelled frantically at him, her arms flailing in pure panic as she realized her wealthy lifestyle had vanished. Before they could even begin to process the devastating reality of their sudden unemployment, a man in a nondescript gray jacket stepped smoothly out of the pedestrian crowd. He approached Courtney with purposeful strides. He verified her identity verbally and immediately handed her a thick, heavily stamped manila envelope. The man turned and disappeared back into the busy flow of foot traffic. Courtney ripped the envelope open with trembling fingers. She pulled out the certified legal documents inside. It was a formal court-approved 30-day eviction notice ordering them to vacate the mansion entirely. The luxury fortress they had proudly claimed as their own was officially stripping them away. The ground completely dissolved beneath their feet. They had no income, no corporate safety net, and now they had exactly 1 month before they would be utterly homeless. Brandon and Courtney staggered back into the grand foyer of the mansion they no longer possessed. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing them inside a fortress that was actively preparing to expel them. Courtney threw the thick manila envelope onto the Italian marble floor, as if it burned her hands. The 30-day formal eviction notice lay completely exposed under the crystal chandelier. Her perfectly constructed high society facade dissolved into pure, unadulterated panic. She began to scream at my son, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. She demanded to know how he had allowed his entire corporate empire and their housing security to vanish in a single afternoon. She paced frantically across the foyer, waving her arms and listing the exorbitant upcoming expenses they were now completely unable to pay. She cited her elite country club membership dues, the lease on her luxury vehicle, and the exorbitant retainer for their private chef. She explicitly ordered Brandon to fix the catastrophic financial ruin, immediately refusing to accept that her days of effortless luxury were officially terminated. Brandon stood paralyzed by the front door, absorbing the full, brutal impact of his wife's conditional loyalty. He had assumed that providing her with a wealthy lifestyle guaranteed her unwavering support. He was now learning that her affection was directly tied to the limits of his corporate credit cards. The reality of their impending homelessness stripped away the final layers of their shared delusion. Brandon realized he could not charm or manipulate his way out of a legally binding eviction mandate enforced by a ruthless corporate holding trust. He needed a massive influx of untraceable liquid capital immediately to appease his furious wife and secure a new physical residence before the 30-day countdown expired. Total desperation drives men to commit acts of spectacular stupidity. Brandon retreated into his lavish home office, locking the heavy mahogany door to escape Courtney's relentless screaming. He collapsed into his leather executive chair and stared blindly at his multiple computer monitors. He was officially stripped of his chief executive officer title, stripped of his 6-figure corporate salary, and permanently barred from accessing the subsidiary operating accounts he had so recklessly embezzled from. He possessed absolutely no verifiable income to secure a legitimate residential mortgage or a standard bank loan. Furthermore, the undeniable proof of his forged power of attorney meant no reputable financial institution in the city would ever do business with him again. He was a corporate pariah entirely devoid of liquid assets. Driven by sheer panic, Brandon opened an encrypted internet browser and began a frantic digital search for unregulated high-risk capital. He bypassed the legitimate banking sector, entirely seeking out predatory commercial lending syndicates willing to issue massive expedited cash loans with minimal federal oversight. He scoured the darkest corners of the financial web, looking for private equity firms that specialized in immediate asset-based lending. These ruthless organizations operated outside standard banking regulations, charging astronomical interest rates in exchange for ignoring the standard due diligence protocols. Brandon knew these predatory lenders did not care about a ruined personal credit score or a recent highly public corporate termination. They only cared about securing high-value physical collateral that they could aggressively seize and immediately liquidate upon a borrower's inevitable default. My son was actively hunting for a financial shark to save him from a rapidly sinking ship, completely ignoring the fact that he was intentionally covering his own body in blood before jumping into the water. Brandon located a notoriously aggressive private equity firm based overseas that promised same-day unverified cash disbursements against commercial real estate equity. The firm required absolutely no personal income verification, demanding only absolute proof of physical collateral valued at triple the requested loan amount. Brandon immediately initiated a digital application for a staggering $1 million cash loan. He desperately needed this massive sum to secure a new luxury property to pacify Courtney and to quietly hire a team of elite criminal defense attorneys to fight his impending corporate embezzlement charges. He blatantly listed the $10 million estate as his primary unencumbered collateral. He knew he did not own the mansion. He knew the authentic deed was securely locked inside Bradley's legal vault. This vital legal reality did not deter him. Brandon utilized sophisticated digital editing software to manipulate a previously scanned copy of the authentic corporate trust deed. He carefully erased my name as the exclusive controlling director of the holding company. He meticulously typed his own name onto the digital document, falsely designating himself as the sole proprietary owner of the entire estate. He then forged a series of fake municipal notary stamps to lend the fabricated document an air of absolute, undeniable legitimacy. He was intentionally committing severe federal wire fraud to secure an illicit commercial payout. He uploaded the falsified deed, his personal banking routing numbers, and a digital signature directly to the predatory lender's secure web portal. Brandon leaned back in his chair and exhaled a long, shaking breath. He firmly believed his digital forgery was completely undetectable. He assumed the overseas firm would simply wire the $1 million directly into his personal checking account before the close of the business day. The predatory lending syndicate operated with terrifying speed, fully intending to trap a desperate borrower in a high-interest snare. Within 2 hours, the overseas firm reviewed the forged collateral documents and formally approved the $1 million cash disbursement. They initiated an immediate international wire transfer, locking a massive financial lion onto the physical address of the estate. Brandon eagerly watched his computer screen, waiting for his personal checking account balance to instantly skyrocket. He was completely unaware of the impenetrable digital armor protecting my commercial assets. When I established the corporate holding trust decades ago, I anticipated the possibility of external fraudulent liens. I instructed Bradley to implement a highly sophisticated security protocol integrated directly with the federal banking routing system. Any incoming wire transfer, legal settlement, or commercial payout explicitly associated with the registered address of the estate is automatically intercepted by the holding company's primary financial firewall. The system instantly overrides the recipient's requested routing number and forcefully redirects the entire sum into a highly secure, restricted corporate escrow account managed exclusively by my legal team. The international wire transfer hit the federal banking network and immediately collided with my corporate security protocols. The $1 million bypassed Brandon's personal checking account entirely. The massive sum was instantly swallowed by my legal escrow, locking the illicit funds safely behind an impenetrable wall of corporate red tape. Brandon sat in his home office, aggressively refreshing his banking application over and over again. His account balance remained at absolute zero. He had just successfully committed documented federal wire fraud, legally mortgaged his father's house to a ruthless overseas syndicate, and handed the entire $1 million payout directly to my attorney. Brandon sat in his home office, bathed in the harsh blue light of his computer monitors. He aggressively refreshed his personal banking application every 30 seconds. He fully expected a massive 7-figure balance to instantly materialize and wipe away his impending ruin. He had already mentally allocated the stolen $1 million. He planned to secure a luxury high-rise condominium for his furious wife and retain an elite criminal defense firm to fight his corporate embezzlement charges. Hour after hour passed in agonizing silence. The banking portal consistently displayed an absolute zero balance. The overseas predatory lending syndicate had functioned exactly as advertised, dispatching the international wire transfer with terrifying speed. However, the transaction never reached Brandon's personal accounts. The illicit funds slammed directly into the impenetrable financial firewall I established decades ago. I had specifically designed my corporate holding trust to aggressively protect its primary assets against hostile external liens. The federal routing system identified the mansion's registered address attached to the incoming wire transfer. My automated security protocols immediately intercepted the payload, forcefully overriding Brandon's designated recipient numbers. The entire million-dollar disbursement was surgically extracted from the public banking sector. It bypassed my son completely and dropped directly into a highly secure, restricted corporate escrow account. I maintained exclusive executive authority over this specific escrow, monitoring its activity through my private terminal. Brandon continued clicking his mouse, completely unaware that his digital heist had failed spectacularly. He assumed standard international processing delays were holding up his salvation. He did not realize he had just successfully executed a massive fraudulent mortgage against a property he did not own, only to hand the entire payout directly to the man he was trying to destroy. My private phone rang sharply on the glass table of my new downtown apartment. Bradley initiated the secure call from his law office, his voice sharp with professional satisfaction. He confirmed the corporate firewall had successfully intercepted the international wire transfer. Bradley verified that exactly $1 million currently sat locked inside our restricted escrow vault. He laid out the absolute severity of the legal trap my son had just triggered. Brandon had formally transmitted a falsified property deed across international digital lines to secure commercial capital. He utilized fraudulent municipal notary stamps to bypass the syndicate's basic compliance checks. By intentionally misrepresenting his ownership of my corporate estate to obtain those funds, Brandon officially committed federal wire fraud. He had escalated his crimes from internal corporate embezzlement to a major federal offense carrying mandatory prison time. Furthermore, the overseas lending syndicate now held a highly illegal, uncollectible lien against my commercial property. Bradley assured me my holding company was entirely protected from their predatory collection tactics. The syndicate possessed a forged document making their claim entirely void in any United States court. Brandon had taken out a massive, highly dangerous loan from a ruthless organization and instantly lost the capital. I instructed Bradley to maintain the absolute lockdown on the escrow account. I refused to return the funds to the syndicate or release a single dollar to my son. The money represented undeniable physical evidence of Brandon's digital forgery. We possessed the exact weapon required to completely dismantle his remaining freedom. I ended the call and watched the city traffic from my balcony, waiting for the inevitable panic to consume my son. The crushing reality of his situation finally breached Brandon's profound arrogance by late afternoon. Desperate and sweating, he placed an aggressive phone call directly to the overseas commercial lender. He furiously demanded to know why his approved capital had not posted to his personal checking account. The syndicate's loan officer reviewed the transaction logs and delivered a crippling dose of reality. The officer coldly informed my son that the international wire had cleared the federal network flawlessly hours ago. However, the American banking system had automatically rerouted the disbursement. The lender explained that the funds were diverted by an overriding security mandate attached to the primary collateral address. The entire $1 million had been delivered directly to the legal proprietary owner of the estate, the holding company I controlled. Brandon dropped his phone onto his desk. The blood drained completely from his face. The magnitude of his disastrous miscalculation hit him with the force of a freight train. He had intentionally forged a legal deed to steal money from a dangerous organization. He had utilized federal wire systems to complete the transaction. His digital fingerprints were permanently stamped on every single fraudulent document. Instead of securing his salvation, he had handed the illicit cash directly to my corporate lawyers. Brandon realized he was now utterly trapped. He owed a ruthless overseas syndicate $1 million plus exorbitant interest, and he possessed absolutely zero capital to repay them. The syndicate would not care about his banking errors. They would simply demand their money. He was facing immediate violent retribution from his creditors and guaranteed federal indictment from the government. His elaborate forgery had transformed into a flawless, inescapable criminal snare. Absolute panic eradicated Brandon's final shreds of logical reasoning. He knew he had to reverse the wire transfer immediately to avoid total destruction. He needed to access the holding company's primary escrow accounts and force the funds back to the overseas lender before they initiated their aggressive collection protocols. Brandon understood my corporate financial architecture just well enough to know his digital skills were entirely useless against my firewalls. Reversing a secured transaction required the physical encrypted hardware tokens that authorized my ultimate executive overrides. I had utilized these specialized biometric flash drives since the early 2000s to prevent external digital breaches into my logistics empire. Brandon knew I kept these hardware tokens locked inside a portable biometric safe. He also knew I had brought that specific safe with me when Courtney packed my bags and forced me out of the mansion. Driven by pure survival instinct, my son formulated a spectacularly reckless plan. He needed to steal those physical tokens directly from my possession to manually wire the stolen $1 million back to the syndicate. He utilized a reverse address search on the town car service I had hired on the night of my eviction. He quickly located the exact luxury downtown apartment building where I had established my new residence. Brandon decided he could not wait for daylight or attempt a legal negotiation. He changed into dark clothing and gathered a set of sophisticated lock-picking tools he had previously purchased online. He planned to execute a silent midnight break-in at my secure apartment, hoping to steal my financial keys while I slept. He was walking blindly into his final defeat. The digital clock on my bedside table shifted to exactly 2 a.m. when the perimeter alert silently illuminated my phone screen. Brandon had driven his leased luxury vehicle across the city parking 3 blocks away from my newly secured downtown apartment building in a pathetic attempt to avoid the exterior security cameras. I watched the live feed from the lobby as my son approached the night porter. Brandon slid a thick stack of $100 bills across the marble reception desk. The underpaid porter discreetly disabled the elevator security protocols, granting Brandon unauthorized access to the exclusive penthouse floor. My son stepped out of the elevator wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt and dark denim, looking like a common street criminal rather than the polished tech executive he pretended to be. He moved silently down the carpeted hallway until he reached my heavy mahogany front door. He pulled a specialized leather pouch from his jacket pocket. The high-definition camera, hidden in my doorbell, recorded him extracting a set of sophisticated lock-picking tools he had undoubtedly ordered online hours earlier. He knelt in front of the brass deadbolt, his hands shaking violently with absolute desperation. He was entirely consumed by the blinding panic of his impending federal wire fraud indictment. He firmly believed that if he could just breach my physical residence, he could steal the encrypted biometric flash drives I used to manage the corporate holding trust. He assumed he could manually reverse the intercepted $1 million international wire transfer before the overseas predatory syndicate realized they had been scammed. He did not understand that I had spent 40 years defending commercial freight yards from highly organized cargo thieves. He was bringing amateur tools to a professional fortress. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked softly as Brandon successfully manipulated the tumblers. He slowly pushed the apartment door open and stepped into the pitch-black foyer. He closed the door behind him with agonizing care, terrified of waking me from what he assumed was a deep, oblivious sleep. He pulled a small pen light from his pocket and aimed the narrow beam at the hardwood floor. He crept past the open kitchen archway and moved deliberately toward the home office. He remembered from previous conversations that I always stored my critical corporate hardware inside a portable biometric safe on my desk. Brandon completely failed to realize that he had already triggered a cascading series of invisible alarms the moment he crossed the threshold. During my initial move into the apartment, I instructed my private security contractors to install an array of military-grade thermal motion sensors throughout the entire floor plan. These specialized sensors did not emit a single audible siren or flashing light. Instead, they transmitted a silent, encrypted live feed directly to the secure application on my mobile device. I sat perfectly still in the darkness, tracking his exact physical coordinates as a glowing red dot moving across my digital blueprint. I watched him navigate the dark hallway, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stepped into my home office and immediately rushed toward the heavy oak desk. He frantically swept his penlight over the polished wood surface, desperately searching for the small steel lockbox containing his financial salvation. He opened the top desk drawer, rifling through empty folders and blank notepads. He was completely blinded by his frantic search for the physical security tokens, utterly unaware that he was not the only person awake inside the room. I sat comfortably in the high-backed leather armchair positioned perfectly in the darkest corner of the home office. I watched my son violently tear through the remaining desk drawers, his frustration mounting with every empty compartment he discovered. I waited until he dropped to his knees to inspect the lower cabinets before I finally made my presence known. I reached out and firmly pressed the master switch on the wall panel. The brilliant overhead LED lights flared to life instantly, completely flooding the room with blinding illumination. Brandon gasped sharply and stumbled backward, dropping his penlight onto the hardwood floor. He shielded his eyes against the sudden glare, his chest heaving with sheer terror. As his vision slowly adjusted to the harsh light, he finally registered me sitting calmly in the armchair directly across from him. I did not raise my voice or stand up to physically threaten him. I simply lifted my right hand. I held up a heavy steel keychain holding the 3 encrypted biometric flash drives he was so desperately hunting for. The metal tokens caught the bright overhead light gleaming like an unattainable prize. I let him stare at the precise instruments of his absolute failure. Brandon realized instantly that the portable safe had never been in the desk. He realized I had watched his entire pathetic break-in from the very beginning. His shoulders slumped forward as the remaining adrenaline instantly drained from his body. He stood frozen in the center of my office, a trespassing criminal caught red-handed by the exact man he had attempted to systematically destroy. I lowered my hand and placed the security tokens safely into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket, locking his fate away forever. Brandon stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, waiting for me to pull out my phone and dial the emergency police dispatch. He fully expected to be placed in handcuffs for felony breaking and entering before the sun came up. I simply pointed toward the open door of the office. I instructed my son to turn around, walk out of my apartment, and return to the temporary motel room he was currently occupying. I coldly informed him that I refused to waste my valuable time processing a petty domestic burglary charge with the local municipal police department. Brandon opened his mouth to offer a pathetic, stammering excuse, but my unwavering glare silenced him immediately. He recognized the absolute finality in my posture. He turned his back on me and walked out of the apartment completely empty-handed, leaving his lock-picking tools abandoned on my floor. I listened to the heavy front door click shut behind him. I immediately opened my security application and downloaded the pristine, high-definition video files of his entire criminal infiltration. I backed up the footage to my secure cloud servers, preserving the undeniable visual proof of his desperate midnight intrusion. I did not call the local authorities because a simple trespassing charge would merely result in a temporary night in a holding cell and a negligible fine. I needed a much more destructive and absolute force to address the sheer magnitude of his financial crimes. I decided to bypass the local police precinct entirely. I prepared to deliver my son directly to a federal agency that specializes in dismantling fraudulent corporate empires without a single ounce of mercy. I spent the remainder of the early morning compiling his forged loan documents for the Internal Revenue Service. The sun began to filter through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown apartment just as I finished compiling the final digital dossier. I did not need to wait for normal business hours to deploy the most destructive weapon in my arsenal. I accessed the secure encrypted portal for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I submitted a comprehensive anonymous tip detailing my son's extensive history of corporate tax evasion. I did not simply provide allegations. I uploaded absolute, undeniable proof of his deeply illegal financial maneuvering. I included the precise routing numbers from the overseas predatory lending syndicate, the meticulously forged real estate deed he had transmitted across federal wire systems, and 3 years of heavily manipulated subsidiary tax returns. In the late 80s, dealing with hostile commercial transport regulators taught me that government agencies move slowly unless you hand them a perfectly wrapped gift that guarantees a massive financial recovery. I handed the federal government a multi-million-dollar fraud case with a brightly colored bow. The digital submission receipt flashed across my monitor, confirming the federal authorities now possessed the exact coordinates of my son's financial crimes. I knew the federal investigators did not issue polite warnings or schedule convenient appointments when dealing with severe commercial wire fraud and unpaid corporate taxes. They operated with ruthless, devastating speed. I closed my laptop, poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, and waited for the federal machinery to descend upon the mansion I had so recently vacated. The federal strike force did not wait for my son to finish his morning routine. Shortly before 9 o'clock, a convoy of dark, unmarked government vehicles sped down the long gravel driveway of the estate. I monitored the entire raid through the hidden perimeter cameras feeding directly to my secure tablet. A dozen federal agents wearing tactical vests and windbreakers emblazoned with the federal insignia swarmed the front porch. They did not gently knock or request permission to enter. The lead agent pounded heavily on the thick oak doors, loudly announcing their presence and demanding immediate entry. Brandon opened the door wearing wrinkled sleepwear, looking completely exhausted from his failed midnight burglary attempt at my apartment. The lead investigator instantly handed my son a comprehensive federal warrant authorizing the immediate seizure of all physical assets to cover his massive estimated tax deficit. Brandon physically staggered backward as the agents pushed past him and flooded into the grand foyer. He attempted to argue wildly, claiming a misunderstanding regarding his corporate accounting software. The investigators completely ignored his pathetic stammering. They possessed absolute judicial authority to dismantle his life and strip the property of anything holding substantial monetary value. They immediately fanned out across the sprawling mansion, carrying heavy cardboard boxes and digital inventory scanners. They began executing a ruthless, systematic liquidation of the lavish lifestyle my son had fraudulently maintained. Brandon stood paralyzed in the center of the Italian marble floor, watching the full weight of the United States government actively confiscate his entire fraudulent reality. Courtney descended the grand staircase, completely hysterical, as the federal agents began clearing out the master suite. She shrieked violently at the investigators, desperately attempting to claim that her personal belongings were entirely separate from her husband's corporate tax liabilities. The lead agent calmly informed her that assets purchased with embezzled corporate funds were legally subject to immediate federal forfeiture. I watched through the security feed as agents systematically removed her extensive collection of high-end designer handbags, carrying them out the front door in clear plastic evidence sacks. Two agents entered her custom walk-in closet and confiscated every piece of expensive jewelry she had acquired over the past 3 years. Courtney sobbed uncontrollably as her diamond tennis bracelets and imported watches were tagged and cataloged by the government. The humiliation escalated dramatically when 2 flatbed tow trucks arrived at the estate. Federal agents confiscated the keys to the 2 brand-new luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway. Courtney ran outside in her silk robe, weeping openly on the manicured lawn as she watched the heavy chains pull her pristine vehicles onto the tow beds. Her entire high society identity was fundamentally tied to those visible symbols of extreme wealth. She stood shivering in the morning air, watching the physical manifestations of her arrogance being unceremoniously loaded into federal transport vehicles. She realized the country club memberships, the private chef, and the endless luxury vacations were permanently terminated. The illusion of her supreme dominance had been entirely stripped away, leaving her standing in front of an empty driveway with absolutely nothing to her name. The chaotic reality of the federal raid forced a sudden, terrifying clarity into Courtney's mind. As she watched the unmarked government vehicles haul away the final remnants of her luxurious existence, she looked over at her husband. Brandon was sitting on the edge of the front porch, his head buried in his hands, completely shattered and unresponsive. Courtney recognized instantly that the man she had married was no longer a rising software executive or the heir to a massive logistics empire. He was a ruined, heavily documented federal criminal staring directly at a decade behind bars. She knew the federal prosecutors would relentlessly pursue every single individual tied to the fraudulent corporate accounts. She realized with chilling certainty that Brandon was going to federal prison, and he would inevitably drag her down into a cell right beside him as a criminal accessory. Self-preservation entirely eclipsed whatever conditional loyalty she had ever held for my son. Courtney made a completely ruthless, calculated decision to save her own freedom at the direct expense of her husband. She quietly stepped away from the weeping man on the porch and retreated to the far edge of the manicured lawn, shielding herself from the view of the federal agents. She pulled her mobile device from her robe pocket with trembling, manicured fingers. She completely abandoned the toxic alliance she had forged with Brandon. She frantically scrolled through her extensive contact list, bypassing her high society friends and her luxury vendors. She aggressively searched her digital address book until she finally located my private unlisted phone number, preparing to offer me a devastating betrayal in exchange for her own salvation. The sharp ring of an unknown number broke the silence of my downtown apartment just past noon. I answered the call and immediately recognized the frantic, shaking voice on the other end of the line. It was Courtney. She was speaking rapidly from a cheap, prepaid cellular device to ensure her husband could not track the outbound communication. The sheer terror in her voice was absolute as she desperately requested a clandestine meeting. She demanded we meet at a secluded, rundown coffee shop located several miles outside the city limits, far away from the prying eyes of the federal agents currently tearing apart my estate. She claimed she possessed highly critical information regarding Brandon's corporate fraud and insisted this intelligence could guarantee her personal salvation. I did not ask her to elaborate over the unsecured line. I simply agreed to the location and abruptly ended the call. I understood exactly what was happening. When cornered by federal authorities, loyalty evaporates instantly among the arrogant and the entitled. She was preparing to throw the man she married directly into the fire to save her own skin. I dressed in a casual jacket and retrieved a highly sensitive military-grade digital audio recorder from my desk drawer. I activated the device and secured it deeply inside my inner breast pocket, ensuring the microphone was perfectly positioned to capture every single syllable of our impending conversation. I drove my personal vehicle out of the city, navigating the quiet suburban roads with cold, calculated anticipation. I was not driving to an emotional family reconciliation. I was driving to a highly strategic interrogation, preparing to document the exact moment my daughter-in-law decided to commit the ultimate betrayal against her own husband. I arrived at the remote diner and found Courtney sitting in a dark corner booth. Her immaculate high society appearance had been entirely erased by the morning's brutal federal raid. She wore a plain gray sweatshirt, her eyes darting nervously toward the entrance every time the door chimes rang. I slid into the vinyl booth across from her and waited in absolute silence. Courtney leaned over the scratched laminate table and launched immediately into her treacherous proposal. She offered to become a primary cooperating witness for the federal prosecution. She swore to stand in open court and testify under oath against Brandon, detailing every single fraudulent wire transfer and falsified tax document he had ever executed. To sweeten her treason, she promised to physically hand over a set of encrypted external hard drives that Brandon had desperately hidden inside the mansion's air conditioning vents just hours before the federal agents arrived. These drives allegedly contained the raw, unedited ledgers of his massive corporate embezzlement. Courtney was willing to deliver the final nail for her husband's coffin, but her betrayal came with an exorbitant price tag. In exchange for her devastating testimony and the hidden digital evidence, she demanded a direct, untraceable cash payout of $500,000 from my corporate holding trust. Furthermore, she insisted that I legally halt her impending 30-day eviction from the estate. She aggressively demanded permanent rent-free residence in the mansion's guest house, falsely believing her willingness to destroy her husband magically restored her leverage over me. She stared at me with desperate, hollow eyes, fully expecting me to eagerly purchase the destructive weapon she was holding. She completely failed to comprehend that I already possessed all the ammunition I needed to bury my son. I sat perfectly still and allowed Courtney to completely finish outlining her venomous extortion attempt. I let the digital recorder hidden inside my jacket capture every single detail of her exorbitant financial demands and her eagerness to send her husband to a federal penitentiary. I did not interrupt her frantic bargaining. Once she finally stopped talking to catch her breath, I leaned forward and delivered my response with icy, absolute precision. I firmly denied her request for a $500,000 cash payout. I explicitly rejected her demand for permanent immunity from the impending estate eviction. I watched the greedy anticipation drain from her pale face as I systematically dismantled her final delusion of control. I calmly informed her that the federal government already possessed more than enough documented evidence to secure a massive wire fraud conviction against Brandon without her treacherous assistance. I told her that her stolen hard drives were entirely redundant because my forensic accountants had already mapped every stolen dollar perfectly. I then addressed the core of her profound disrespect. I stated with unwavering authority that I absolutely never negotiate with individuals who zip-tie my luggage and order me out of my own home in the middle of the night. I reminded her of the deep arrogance she displayed in the grand foyer when she explicitly declared me a burden to her marriage. I told her that she chose to build her luxurious life on a foundation of stolen money and profound disrespect. I stood up from the vinyl booth, leaving her to face the full, unmitigated weight of her impending federal indictment and absolute homelessness. I walked out of the dingy coffee shop without looking back, leaving her completely stranded and utterly defeated in the corner booth. I transmitted the high-definition audio file and watched the digital delivery receipt confirm its arrival on the personal mobile device belonging to Brandon. My son stood in the center of the stripped marble foyer of the mansion, surrounded by the physical wreckage of his fraudulent corporate empire. He tapped the screen, and the unmistakable sound of his wife negotiating the exact price of his federal imprisonment echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings. Courtney walked into the foyer just as her own recorded voice demanded $500,000 in permanent immunity in exchange for handing over the hidden hard drives. The toxic illusion holding their marriage together evaporated in a single devastating instant. Brandon hurled his phone across the room where it shattered against the imported stone floor. He unleashed a blind, screaming rage at the woman he had committed severe federal wire fraud to please. Courtney shrieked back with equal ferocity, blaming his monumental corporate incompetence for their sudden, absolute poverty. Their vicious argument violently tore through the empty halls of the estate. Self-preservation entirely consumed whatever conditional affection they once shared. They both realized the federal government was preparing to indict them, and they instantly scrambled to secure any remaining financial leverage to pay for criminal defense attorneys. They each rushed to the county courthouse the very next morning to file highly contested divorce petitions against one another. They transformed their failed marriage into a brutal legal warpath, seeking to completely destroy each other to save themselves. They blindly assumed that whoever won the divorce settlement would automatically win the right to liquidate the massive estate they currently occupied. They failed to realize they were violently fighting over the division of a phantom kingdom that I entirely controlled. The bitter divorce proceedings commenced rapidly in the municipal family court. Brandon and Courtney sat at opposite ends of the sterile courtroom, refusing to make eye contact with one another. Courtney sat beside a deeply inexpensive attorney she had hired using the last remaining limits of a high-interest credit card. The lawyer representing Courtney stood before the exhausted family court judge and aggressively argued that she was legally entitled to exactly half the total market value of the $10 million estate. The attorney falsely claimed the mansion constituted a shared marital asset because Courtney had managed the interior decorations and oversaw the domestic staff for the past 3 years. Brandon jumped out of his chair in a furious panic. He loudly argued that he was my only biological son and therefore the sole rightful heir to the entire property. He desperately attempted to convince the judge that my departure from the house constituted a permanent legal abandonment of the asset. He insisted that Courtney possessed absolutely no equity in the estate and demanded the judge award him exclusive proprietary ownership so he could sell the land to cover his impending federal penalties. I sat quietly in the back row of the public gallery, observing the spectacular magnitude of their shared delusion. I remembered spending decades building my commercial trucking fleet by securing ironclad contracts and navigating ruthless corporate law. My son and his wife were attempting to secure wealth entirely through loud complaints and fraudulent entitlement. They were aggressively demanding the judicial division of a multi-million-dollar property without providing a single piece of authentic physical documentation to prove their ownership. They expected the family court to simply hand them a fortune based entirely on their sheer audacity and arrogance. The family court judge demanded that both parties produce the physical property deed to verify their outrageous financial claims. Before Brandon or Courtney could offer another pathetic excuse, my lead corporate attorney walked confidently through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Bradley bypassed the spectator gallery and approached the judicial bench with absolute professional authority. He formally introduced himself to the judge as the exclusive legal representative of the Commercial Logistics Holding Company. Bradley placed a thick leather binder directly onto the desk of the judge. He extracted the original certified property deed bearing the authentic municipal seals and the unalterable corporate watermarks. Bradley calmly explained to the court that the sprawling estate was exclusively registered to a private commercial trust and was completely insulated from any personal family disputes. He systematically dismantled the fabricated arguments presented by both Brandon and Courtney in less than 2 minutes. Bradley proved with absolute undeniable paperwork that my son and his wife possessed absolutely zero legal equity in the property whatsoever. He explicitly informed the court that Brandon and Courtney were nothing more than unauthorized occupants residing in a corporate asset without a valid lease agreement. The inexpensive attorney representing Courtney immediately packed up his briefcase and stepped away from the defense table, realizing his client had blatantly lied to him about her financial portfolio. Brandon stared at the pristine corporate documents in total shock. His final desperate strategy to liquidate the mansion to pay off his predatory commercial loans was entirely eradicated by a single piece of paper. He had brought his divorce to a court of law only to have his profound lack of ownership permanently and publicly entered into the official municipal record for everyone to see. The family court judge reviewed the authentic corporate trust documents and glared down at Brandon and Courtney with profound judicial disgust. The judge severely reprimanded both of them for wasting the valuable time of the court by aggressively attempting to divide massive real estate assets they clearly did not own. The judge stated their actions bordered on systemic perjury and warned them against filing any further fraudulent financial claims within his jurisdiction. Bradley then presented the judge with a certified copy of the formal 30-day eviction notice that the process server had delivered to Courtney during her corporate humiliation weeks ago. Bradley explained that the legal 30-day window was rapidly closing and the unauthorized occupants were actively refusing to leave the premises. The judge reviewed the eviction documentation and immediately validated the corporate mandate. The court issued an emergency binding vacate order, effectively overriding any standard municipal delays. The judge slammed his wooden gavel and explicitly commanded Brandon and Courtney to remove their physical presence from the estate entirely within 48 hours. He warned them that any failure to comply with the accelerated timeline would result in their immediate arrest for criminal trespassing on commercial property. The massive legal anvil finally crushed the last remaining fragments of their arrogance. Brandon and Courtney walked out of the courtroom completely destitute and officially bound for absolute homelessness in exactly 2 days. They possessed absolutely no income, no corporate safety net, and no legal leverage. Facing the terrifying reality of sleeping on the street, Brandon lost all capacity for rational thought. He returned to the empty mansion and decided he would rather physically destroy the architecture of his childhood home than walk away completely empty-handed and defeated. The 48-hour eviction mandate issued by the family court judge operated like a rapidly ticking time bomb inside Brandon's mind. He returned alone to the cavernous silence of the mansion he no longer possessed. Courtney had abandoned him immediately after the disastrous hearing, completely severing their toxic alliance to focus entirely on her own legal survival. The sheer magnitude of his impending homelessness finally shattered my son's remaining capacity for rational thought. He wandered through the sprawling, empty corridors of the estate, staring at the extravagant architectural details I had paid for in cash a decade ago. He realized the federal agents had confiscated every single portable item of value during their morning raid. There were no luxury vehicles left in the driveway, no designer watches in the master suite, and no hidden electronics to pawn for immediate liquid capital. Brandon knew he desperately needed untraceable cash to secure a cheap motel and fund his inevitable escape from the looming federal indictments. Stripped of his executive title and barred from his corporate accounts, he possessed absolutely zero legal methods to generate revenue. His profound panic rapidly mutated into a violently destructive resentment. If the corporate holding trust refused to let him keep the luxury estate, he decided he would brutally extract his severance package directly from its bones. He resolved to completely gut the interior of the mansion and strip the property of its fundamental raw materials. He planned to tear down the very walls that had sheltered his arrogance for the past 3 years. He falsely believed that dismantling the physical house would somehow hurt my bottom line and provide him with the ultimate spiteful victory. He convinced himself that destroying my property was his final remaining right as my son. Brandon gathered the last few crumpled $20 bills from his desk drawer and drove his cheap rental car to a commercial hardware supply store on the outskirts of the city. He aggressively bypassed the standard home improvement aisles and went directly to the heavy demolition equipment rentals. He acquired a massive steel sledgehammer, 2 industrial crowbars, and a set of heavy-duty wire cutters designed for thick commercial electrical cables. He meticulously calculated the illicit scrap value of the estate's high-end materials. The sprawling mansion contained miles of thick premium copper wiring running behind the imported drywall. The master bathrooms and the grand foyer featured solid slabs of imported Italian marble and custom brass plumbing fixtures. Brandon planned to systematically smash through the walls, rip the valuable copper cables from their housing, and pry the expensive marble tiles directly off the floors. He intended to load the raw, heavy materials into the back of his rented vehicle under the cover of darkness. He knew several unregulated cash-only scrap metal yards operating in the industrial sector of the city that would eagerly purchase the stolen copper and brass with absolutely no questions asked. He calculated he could easily generate $20,000 or $30,000 in untraceable cash by completely destroying the structural integrity of the estate. He envisioned using this illicit scrap money to disappear across state lines before the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation could officially file their looming wire fraud indictments. He packed the heavy demolition tools into his trunk, fully prepared to reduce a $10 million corporate asset to a pile of worthless rubble just to secure a few nights in a cheap motel. He was willing to desecrate the very halls he once proudly showcased to his high society friends, proving his entire identity was nothing more than a hollow performance. I sat in my downtown apartment and anticipated this exact scorched earth behavior from my son. In the late 80s, I watched desperate logistics competitors burn down their own freight yards rather than hand the keys over to the banks during massive commercial foreclosures. Total financial ruin consistently drives arrogant men to commit acts of extreme, spiteful vandalism. I also vividly remembered a specific incident from Brandon's childhood where he purposefully smashed an expensive remote control car into a brick wall simply because I told him he had to share it with a neighborhood friend. I knew with absolute certainty that Brandon would attempt to physically damage the mansion before the 48-hour eviction window expired. I refused to let my son inflict a single scratch on the corporate property I had worked tirelessly to secure. I immediately contacted a highly elite, private security contracting firm that specialized in protecting high-value commercial assets during hostile corporate takeovers. I bypassed standard neighborhood patrol services and specifically hired a team of armed, highly trained tactical guards. I authorized an exorbitant premium to deploy this specialized unit within the hour. I instructed the security commander to station his personnel directly inside the grand marble foyer of the estate 24 hours a day. I gave them explicit, unwavering orders to secure the entire perimeter and deny my son any opportunity to wield his destructive frustration against the architecture. I monitored the deployment through the external camera feeds, watching the imposing black security vehicles quietly take their strategic positions around the property. The security contractors locked the perimeter, completely sealing off the interior rooms from any unauthorized access. The mansion was no longer just an empty house waiting for an eviction. It was an actively guarded corporate fortress. Brandon arrived back at the estate shortly after sunset, carrying the heavy steel sledgehammer and the industrial crowbars across the manicured front lawn. He approached the towering oak front doors with a violent, reckless energy, completely ready to smash the foyer's custom glass panels into thousands of pieces. He forcefully kicked the front door open and aggressively marched into the entryway, raising the heavy sledgehammer above his shoulder. He abruptly froze in his tracks. 4 broad-shouldered, heavily armed private security contractors stood in a perfect tactical line directly across the Italian marble floor. The lead security commander stepped forward, resting his hand casually near his tactical belt, and blocked my son's path to the interior hallways. The commander did not raise his voice or draw a weapon. He coldly informed Brandon that the estate was now an actively secured commercial asset owned entirely by the holding trust. I explicitly warned my son that swinging the sledgehammer or causing any physical damage to the property would result in an immediate citizen's arrest for felony vandalism of corporate infrastructure. The commander promised to hold Brandon on the marble floor and personally hand him over to the local police department, accelerating his inevitable trip to a federal holding cell. The sheer overwhelming presence of the tactical team instantly evaporated Brandon's destructive rage. He realized his final spiteful plan had been flawlessly anticipated and completely neutralized. He possessed absolutely no power to harm me physically, financially, or structurally. The heavy steel sledgehammer slipped from his trembling hands and crashed onto the floor with a loud, hollow thud. Brandon collapsed to his knees, utterly defeated by the impenetrable walls I had built around my legacy. He stared at the floor, finally understanding that he was completely trapped in a cage of his own making. My son dropped his sledgehammer on the Italian marble and fled the estate. He drove his rented sedan away from the secure perimeter and navigated to a deeply unsavory commercial district on the outskirts of the city. He paid for a dilapidated motel room using the last remnants of his physical cash. He spent the entire night shivering on a stained mattress, completely isolated from the luxurious ecosystem I had previously financed. As morning broke over the dreary motel parking lot, Brandon aggressively scoured the internet on his mobile device, desperately hunting for any remaining leverage. He bypassed his frozen bank accounts and checked the local municipal news feeds. A headline from the Regional Business Journal caught his attention. The local Chamber of Commerce was hosting its annual executive gala that exact evening. The article highlighted the primary event of the night. The board of directors was honoring my 40 years of commercial logistics innovations with a prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award. Brandon stared at the digital photograph of my face on his cracked screen. His profound despair instantly mutated into a reckless, deeply misplaced vindictiveness. He realized the most powerful corporate leaders, venture capitalists, and municipal politicians in the state would be gathered in a single ballroom. He formulated a spectacular, catastrophic plan. He decided to leverage the highly public nature of the ceremony to orchestrate my ultimate social destruction. He intended to publicly confront me in front of my esteemed peers. He believed he could hijack the narrative, play the victim of a ruthless billionaire father, and force the business community to universally condemn my actions. He assumed public shaming would compel me to restore his access to the corporate trust. He spent the rest of the day pacing the cramped motel room, rehearsing a venomous script designed to shatter my immaculate professional reputation. The grand ballroom of the Civic Center was packed with the most influential commercial operators in the state. I stood at the podium in a tailored tuxedo, looking out at a room full of bankers and investors who used to deny my freight contracts in the early 1980s. The master of ceremonies handed me the heavy crystal plaque honoring my lifetime contributions to the regional economy. I adjusted the microphone and prepared to deliver my acceptance speech. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly burst open, slamming violently against the paneled walls. Brandon marched down the center aisle. He wore the exact same designer suit he had worn during the federal raid, now deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat from his night in the cheap motel. His sudden aggressive entrance instantly silenced the polite applause of the crowd. Security guards moved to intercept him, but Brandon violently shoved past a waiter and marched directly toward the elevated stage. He pointed an accusatory finger at my chest, his face contorted with unhinged fury. He screamed at the top of his lungs, projecting his voice across the massive room. He declared to the horrified audience that the man receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award was a ruthless, abusive monster. He loudly accused me of violently abandoning my own flesh and blood. He claimed I had maliciously evicted him and his wife, forcing them into absolute homelessness on the streets without a single dollar to their names. He painted a pathetic picture of a tyrannical father hoarding generational wealth while actively terrorizing his family. He demanded the chamber revoke my award, insisting I lacked the basic human morality required for such a prestigious public honor. He stood panting at the foot of the stage, waiting for the audience to turn against me. I did not flinch or step back from the podium. I did not order the security personnel to physically remove him from the room. I simply adjusted the microphone to ensure my voice carried unparalleled clarity across the silent ballroom. I looked down at my son and spoke with a cold, terrifying precision. I informed the gathered executives that the man shouting at the foot of the stage was indeed my biological son. I then systematically dismantled his pathetic victim narrative using absolute, undeniable facts. I detailed his extensive corporate embezzlement, explaining exactly how he had drained his subsidiary logistics brokerage to fund a lavish personal lifestyle. I outlined his aggressive attempt to forcibly commit me to a psychiatric ward using unlicensed medical personnel to seize control of my holding company. I did not stop there. I exposed his most recent and severe criminal failure directly to the prominent commercial lenders sitting in the front rows. I stated that Brandon had actively utilized digital editing software to forge a legal property deed. I explained how he transmitted that fraudulent document across international lines to secure a $1 million cash loan from an overseas predatory syndicate. I clarified that my eviction mandate was not an act of spontaneous malice, but the direct legal consequence of his documented federal wire fraud. I presented his actions not as a private family dispute, but as a severe corporate liability. I spoke the unvarnished truth into the microphone, stripping away every single layer of his fabricated martyrdom. I laid bare his profound entitlement and his staggering criminal incompetence for the entire business community to examine. I finished my statement in total silence, staring down at a man who had just provided the rope for his own public execution. The silence in the grand ballroom transformed into a palpable, suffocating wave of collective disgust. The elite bankers, venture capitalists, and municipal leaders recoiled from Brandon as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. In the ruthless ecosystem of commercial enterprise, personal failure is pitied, but active corporate fraud is permanently unforgivable. The executives in the room realized Brandon was a massive financial liability who had actively attempted to defraud institutional lenders and orchestrate a hostile medical takeover. The lead organizer of the event gestured sharply to the perimeter security team. 4 armed guards immediately flanked my son. They firmly grasped his arms and physically marched him back down the center aisle. Brandon did not struggle or shout any further accusations. The crushing weight of his absolute social and professional annihilation paralyzed his vocal cords. He watched the faces of his former peers turn away in profound contempt as he was forcefully escorted out of the building. My public disclosure permanently blacklisted him from the entire regional economy. No bank would ever approve a loan bearing his signature. No logistics firm would ever hire him for a basic management position. No investor would ever take his phone calls. He was completely excised from the corporate world. I stood at the podium and delivered the remainder of my acceptance speech to a captivated, deeply respectful audience. The ceremony concluded with a standing ovation. Brandon was thrown out onto the cold concrete of the city streets. He possessed absolutely no money, no shelter, no professional network, and no remaining leverage. His entire existence had been reduced to a looming federal indictment. Stripped of every single defense mechanism, my son realized he had exactly one terrifying option left to avoid a decade in a federal penitentiary. The hammer of the federal government does not fall quickly, but when it finally strikes, it shatters everything underneath it. I sat in my downtown apartment listening to Bradley read the official press release from the Department of Justice over the phone. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service had officially unsealed their joint indictments. My son was formally charged with 3 counts of federal wire fraud, massive corporate tax evasion, and the deliberate falsification of commercial loan documents. The authorities had meticulously traced the forged property deed he used to secure the $1 million overseas loan directly back to his personal digital address. They mapped every single embezzled dollar he had siphoned from the logistics brokerage. In the early 90s, vicious competitors tried to bury my expanding trucking fleet by submitting anonymous false reports to federal tax authorities. I survived those brutal audits without a single penalty because I kept my physical ledgers absolutely immaculate. I knew firsthand the terrifying microscopic scrutiny of federal financial investigators. Brandon had spent his entire executive career treating corporate accounts like a personal slush fund. He completely lacked the discipline required to survive a genuine government audit. The prosecutors possessed a flawless documented trail of his staggering financial crimes. He was officially a disgraced indicted felon completely exposed to the unforgiving machinery of the United States justice system. The news of his indictment spread instantly across the local commercial sector, validating the public execution I had delivered at the Chamber of Commerce gala. The business community permanently locked their doors to him. His absolute ruin was now a matter of public record, permanently etched into federal databases. Courtney did not escape the catastrophic blast radius of her husband's implosion. She firmly believed that offering to testify against Brandon at the remote coffee shop would guarantee her absolute immunity. She severely underestimated the competence of the Financial Crimes Division. The federal prosecutors did not need her treacherous cooperation to build a lethal case against my son. Instead, they turned their aggressive focus directly onto her. The authorities formally indicted Courtney as a primary criminal accessory to grand theft and federal fraud. The detectives who detained her at the luxury auction house had preserved her signed confession regarding the stolen African-American art collection. The prosecutors linked her direct attempt to fence federally registered cultural artifacts to Brandon's broader pattern of corporate embezzlement. Her frantic attempt to flee the country with a one-way ticket to Geneva only solidified her guilt in the eyes of the law. The indictment officially stripped away the final remnants of her high society illusion. She was no longer a wealthy corporate wife attending exclusive charity galas. She was a documented criminal facing severe felony charges. The elite country club friends she had desperately tried to impress completely abandoned her the moment her name appeared in the federal charging documents. The women who used to drink champagne in my mansion refused to return her panicked phone calls. Her designer wardrobe and imported jewelry remained locked inside government evidence lockers. She realized too late that marrying into wealth did not provide a shield against federal prosecution. She had chosen to act like a common burglar, and the justice system was preparing to treat her exactly like one. The immediate legal consequences of their federal indictments were brutally restrictive. The presiding judge labeled both Brandon and Courtney as extreme flight risks due to her intercepted escape attempt at the international terminal and his reckless dealings with an overseas predatory syndicate. The court permanently revoked their passports and strictly forbade them from traveling outside the municipal district. Stripped of their mobility, they faced an even more terrifying logistical nightmare. The federal government maintained the absolute freeze on all their personal checking accounts and secondary credit lines. The illicit wealth they had accumulated was legally seized. They possessed absolutely zero liquid capital to hire the elite, high-powered criminal defense attorneys they so desperately needed. The ruthless lawyers who typically defend wealthy executives demanded massive six-figure retainers up front. Brandon and Courtney could not even afford a basic legal consultation. They were forced to submit themselves to the public defender system. They stood in the crowded, dingy hallways of the federal courthouse waiting for hours to speak with an overworked, underpaid public attorney who was juggling dozens of other felony cases. Their assigned legal counsel did not offer them comforting lies or aggressive courtroom strategies. The public defender took one look at the mountain of immaculate digital evidence, the forged real estate deeds, and the audio recordings. The lawyer bluntly informed them that fighting the charges in open court would be procedural suicide. The sheer reality of standing in a municipal building with absolutely no financial leverage broke the final pillars of their arrogance. They had always believed the law only applied to people who could not afford to bend it. Now they were the exact destitute citizens they had spent their entire lives mocking. The neon sign of the highway diner buzzed with a harsh mechanical rhythm against the dark rain. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back emergency exit. This rundown establishment sat on the very edge of the industrial sector, far away from the elite financial district. In the early 80s, I spent countless nights in diners exactly like this one, drinking burnt coffee and negotiating my very first commercial freight contracts with skeptical regional dispatchers. Brandon always despised this side of the city. He considered manual labor and industrial zones entirely beneath his high society pedigree. He walked through the glass doors at midnight looking entirely unrecognizable. The federal indictments had completely stripped away his polished executive armor. He wore a faded hooded sweatshirt and a cheap rain jacket. His posture was severely hunched. Dark, heavy circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. The terrifying reality of the United States justice system had permanently erased every single ounce of his profound arrogance. He slid into the booth across from me without ordering a drink. His hands trembled violently on the scratched laminate table. He looked around the empty diner as if he expected federal agents to suddenly emerge from the kitchen to arrest him again. I maintained absolute silence and allowed him to sit in the suffocating weight of his own profound failure. He was no longer a wealthy software chief executive barking orders at a terrified staff. He was a ruined, indicted felon desperately seeking a miraculous escape hatch. I looked at the broken man sitting across from me and felt absolutely zero paternal instinct to catch his inevitable fall. I simply drank my coffee and waited for him to present his pathetic final negotiation. Brandon leaned over the table and immediately launched into a frantic, desperate plea. He bypassed any attempt at a genuine apology and went straight for my corporate checkbook. He begged me for a direct, untraceable cash loan of $200,000. He explained that his assigned public defender was entirely incompetent and wanted him to plead guilty to all federal charges. He desperately needed elite private legal counsel to negotiate a favorable plea deal and avoid the maximum mandatory sentence of 10 years in a maximum security penitentiary. He clasped his shaking hands together and began making wildly unrealistic promises. He swore he would pay back every single cent with interest. He offered to sweep the floors of my commercial warehouses or drive local delivery routes just to work off the massive debt. When financial promises failed to move me, he weaponized the biological bond of our family. He pleaded for salvation by invoking the memory of me raising him as a single father. He asked how I could possibly allow my own flesh and blood to rot inside a federal cell. He tried to manipulate my sense of paternal duty, demanding that I use my massive wealth to shield him from the consequences he had actively orchestrated. He firmly believed that despite his blatant corporate embezzlement and his forged real estate deeds, my money would always serve as his ultimate shield. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for me to pull a blank check from my jacket pocket and instantly erase his impending prison sentence. He completely failed to understand that a man who builds an empire from nothing never finances the enemies who try to tear it down. I looked directly into my son's terrified eyes and denied him any comfort. I did not raise my voice or show a single trace of anger. I spoke with the cold, calculated precision of a man delivering a final corporate verdict. I calmly recited the exact text message he had sent me at 2:50 in the morning months ago. I repeated his words verbatim, stating that my presence in his house was causing too much stress for his marriage. I reminded him that he explicitly demanded distance and ordered me to stop contacting him because he needed space to grow. I watched the blood drain completely from his face as his own arrogant words were weaponized against him. I told Brandon that he chose to treat his father as a completely disposable burden the moment he believed he had secured my wealth. He was perfectly willing to orchestrate an illegal medical kidnapping and forge federal real estate documents to throw me onto the street. I explicitly stated that he only remembered the concept of family when he needed a human bank account to save him from a catastrophic federal indictment. I informed him that I spent 40 years breaking my back on loading docks to ensure he received an elite private education. I paid for his pristine upbringing to forge a man of absolute integrity and honor. Instead, my financial generosity had forged a lazy, entitled criminal who tried to cannibalize his own father for a quick payout. I told him that buying his way out of federal prison would only reinforce the toxic delusion that he was immune to reality. I refused to purchase character that simply did not exist within him. Brandon stared at me in absolute stunned silence. He opened his mouth to formulate another desperate excuse, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The crushing realization that my financial vault was permanently sealed finally broke his spirit. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. Brandon briefly leaned forward, expecting to see a leather checkbook emerge. I pulled out a single crisp $20 bill and placed it flat on the scratched laminate table to cover my untouched cup of black coffee. I looked down at the man I had raised and delivered my absolute final statement. I told Brandon that actions dictate permanent consequences. He chose to forge federal loan documents, and he chose to commit severe commercial wire fraud. He built a fraudulent castle out of stolen paper, and now he had to face the flames alone. I stood up from the vinyl booth and adjusted my jacket. I did not offer him a hug or a word of parting sympathy. I turned my back on my only son and walked purposefully toward the glass doors of the diner. I stepped out into the freezing rain and walked to my waiting vehicle. I left Brandon sitting completely alone in the dark corner booth, staring at the $20 bill on the table. He was officially abandoned to the ruthless mercy of the federal court system. I drove back to my secure downtown apartment, leaving the wreckage of his entitlement far behind me in the industrial sector. The parasitic noise of his endless demands was finally silenced forever. My wealth, my dignity, and my legacy were entirely secure. I prepared to watch the United States justice system finish the exact job I had started. The federal trial moved with the ruthless efficiency of a well-oiled commercial freight operation. The United States justice system did not tolerate procedural delays when presented with a fully documented financial conspiracy. I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the federal courthouse and watched the prosecuting attorneys systematically dismantle my son's entire existence. The government lawyers did not need to rely on emotional testimonies or circumstantial assumptions. They constructed an impenetrable fortress of digital evidence using the immaculate paper trail I had personally delivered to their secure servers. The prosecution prominently displayed the falsified real estate deed Brandon had transmitted to the overseas predatory lending syndicate. They projected the forged municipal notary stamps onto the massive courtroom monitors for the jury to meticulously inspect. The most devastating blow arrived when the lead prosecutor played the crystal-clear audio recording of Courtney sitting inside the remote diner. Her desperate voice echoed through the sterile courtroom, explicitly detailing her eager willingness to sell her husband's hidden hard drives for a massive cash payout. The raw audio explicitly verified her deep complicity in the grand theft of my curated African-American art collection and her intimate knowledge of Brandon's corporate embezzlement. I watched the faces of the jurors harden as they absorbed the absolute greed dripping from her recorded words. I had spent decades ensuring my commercial freight manifests were completely unassailable by aggressive government auditors. I applied that exact same rigorous standard to the documentation of their ultimate betrayal. The prosecutors simply connected the flawless dots I had provided, building an impenetrable criminal narrative that left absolutely no room for reasonable doubt or judicial leniency. The federal machine ground their arrogant illusions into fine dust directly before my very eyes. The overworked public defenders assigned to their respective cases mounted a spectacularly weak defense. They possessed absolutely zero financial resources to hire specialized expert witnesses or private forensic accountants to challenge the overwhelming government data. Bereft of high-powered legal counsel, Brandon and Courtney completely abandoned any remaining pretense of marital solidarity. They turned on each other with a vicious, feral intensity right inside the crowded federal courtroom. Brandon took the witness stand and aggressively blamed his wife for the entire financial collapse. He frantically testified that Courtney's insatiable demand for high society luxury and her exorbitant personal spending habits had actively forced him into a state of severe corporate desperation. He falsely claimed she explicitly manipulated him into executing the fraudulent offshore loan just to secure a new mansion. Courtney immediately retaliated with devastating legal venom. Her assigned public defender brutally cross-examined Brandon, weaponizing his own internal corporate memos to prove his massive ego drove the subsidiary embezzlement long before my eviction mandate occurred. She loudly sobbed to the captivated jury, painting herself as a naive, terrified spouse who was continually manipulated by a deeply corrupt logistics executive. She shrieked that Brandon had completely orchestrated the basement vault breach and ordered her to pawn the rare art collection under the severe threat of absolute financial ruin. They viciously tore each other apart in front of the presiding federal judge, fully exposing the deep toxic rot that had always served as the true foundation of their marriage. Their complete mutual destruction saved the prosecution hours of cross-examination. I watched the two people who had once confidently zipped my luggage shut now desperately trying to throw one another under the massive tires of an approaching federal freight train. Their public betrayal was an absolute spectacle. The presiding federal judge did not require a lengthy deliberation period to determine their ultimate fates. He stared down from the high mahogany bench with a look of profound judicial disgust. The judge delivered a blistering reprimand regarding their sheer audacity, noting that their elaborate criminal schemes were driven entirely by unmitigated greed rather than any genuine financial hardship. He methodically read the final verdicts into the permanent federal record. Brandon was found legally guilty on all major counts of severe commercial wire fraud and corporate tax evasion. The judge sternly sentenced my son to 5 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, aggressively denying any request for early parole or minimum security placement. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block, instantly terminating Brandon's entire life as a privileged corporate executive. The judge then turned his unforgiving attention directly toward my daughter-in-law. Courtney was found legally guilty of grand theft and serving as an active criminal accessory to federal wire fraud. The court severely sentenced her to 3 years behind bars in a federal women's correctional facility. The judge explicitly noted her desperate attempt to flee across international borders as the primary reason for enforcing the maximum allowable sentence for her specific accessory charges. I listened to the heavy absolute finality of the prison sentences echoing loudly through the quiet courtroom. They had aggressively demanded total independence from my authority, and the United States government had just granted them a highly structured, heavily monitored isolation. The massive financial debts they accumulated would remain permanently attached to their individual names, ensuring they would remain completely destitute long after their eventual release from prison. I sat perfectly still in the gallery, feeling an immense sense of closure as the judge formally dismissed the court. I remained seated in the back row of the polished spectator gallery as the courtroom slowly emptied. I watched with total emotional detachment as two armed federal marshals approached the defense tables. They securely fastened heavy steel handcuffs around Brandon's wrists. Another officer placed strict restraints on Courtney. My son looked over his shoulder one final time, searching the back rows for any lingering trace of paternal salvation. I held his gaze with cold, absolute neutrality. I did not offer him a comforting nod or a final wave of forgiveness. I simply let him absorb the monumental gravity of his own devastating choices. The marshals forcefully guided them toward the side exit leading directly to the subterranean holding cells. I watched the heavy reinforced steel doors swing shut behind them, permanently swallowing the two people who had so violently attempted to steal my legacy. The loud, toxic noise of their endless entitlement, their constant financial demands, and their profound arrogance was instantly silenced by the locking mechanisms of the federal justice system. The exhausting legal war I had quietly waged from my hotel suite was finally over. I had systematically dismantled their fraudulent reality without ever raising my voice or compromising my own integrity. I stood up from the wooden bench, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, and walked out of the federal courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight. I did not feel any sorrow for the destruction of their artificial lives. I only felt a deep, resonant peace. I had successfully protected the vast commercial empire I had sacrificed 40 years of my life to build. I walked toward my waiting town car, fully prepared to reclaim the physical estate they had tried to steal, completely unburdened by the parasitic weight of their bottomless greed. I returned to the sprawling estate early on a Tuesday morning, stepping out of my town car into the crisp, unapologetic daylight. I unlocked the heavy oak front doors and walked directly into the grand foyer. The space was entirely stripped of its former artificial glory. The federal authorities had systematically confiscated every piece of imported furniture, every crystal fixture, and every visible symbol of the fraudulent wealth my son had desperately tried to project. The vast Italian marble floor stretched out before me, gleaming under the morning sun that poured through the massive skylights. The acoustics of the room amplified the steady, even rhythm of my dress shoes. I stood in the exact spot where Courtney had zip-tied my canvas duffel bags in the middle of the night months ago. I closed my eyes and actively searched my heart for any lingering trace of sorrow or paternal regret. I found absolutely nothing but a profound, unshakable clarity. The mansion no longer echoed with the toxic, shrill demands of a daughter-in-law who viewed me as a disposable obstacle. The walls no longer absorbed the pathetic, arrogant lies of a son who believed he could steal my life's work without facing the federal consequences. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of their boundless entitlement had been completely eradicated by the sheer force of the United States justice system. I walked through the empty, formal dining room and into the expansive living quarters, observing the physical void left behind by their catastrophic ambition. I did not feel any sense of loss while touring the vacant architecture. I realized that removing the parasitic elements from my environment was not an act of destruction, but an act of profound preservation. The estate was finally clean. Bradley arrived precisely at noon, carrying a sleek leather briefcase containing the final binding legal instruments. We bypassed my former guest wing and set up a temporary workspace on a simple folding table directly in the center of the empty grand ballroom. Bradley unclasped his briefcase and meticulously arranged a thick stack of certified corporate trust documents before me. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen, nodding with absolute professional respect. I did not intend to sell this multi-million-dollar property to another wealthy family or liquidate the land for commercial development. I leaned over the table and signed my name across the master transfer deed, legally donating the entire $10 million estate to a highly specialized municipal nonprofit organization. I specifically selected a foundation dedicated to teaching advanced financial literacy, commercial logistics, and rigorous business ethics to young African-American entrepreneurs. 40 years ago, I built my commercial trucking fleet while actively fighting against ruthless systemic banking discrimination and predatory lending practices. I survived those brutal decades because I maintained immaculate ledgers and refused to compromise my integrity. My son had possessed every conceivable advantage and chose to become a common corporate embezzler. I determined that the physical structure which had incubated his massive greed would now be systematically transformed into a classroom for uncompromising integrity. The sprawling bedrooms would become student dormitories, and the massive executive offices would host intensive seminars on corporate compliance and federal tax law. I handed the fully executed transfer deed back to my attorney, finalizing the irrevocable donation. The foundation would immediately take possession of the grounds, utilizing my former fortress to actively train the next generation of resilient, ethical business leaders. My wealth would no longer finance arrogance. It would fund genuine structural empowerment. I returned to the sprawling estate early on a Tuesday morning, stepping out of my town car into the crisp, unapologetic daylight. I unlocked the heavy oak front doors and walked directly into the grand foyer. The space was entirely stripped of its former artificial glory. The federal authorities had systematically confiscated every piece of imported furniture, every crystal fixture, and every visible symbol of the fraudulent wealth my son had desperately tried to project. The vast Italian marble floor stretched out before me, gleaming under the morning sun that poured through the massive skylights. The acoustics of the room amplified the steady, even rhythm of my dress shoes. I stood in the exact spot where Courtney had zip-tied my canvas duffel bags in the middle of the night months ago. I closed my eyes and actively searched my heart for any lingering trace of sorrow or paternal regret. I found absolutely nothing but a profound, unshakable clarity. The mansion no longer echoed with the toxic, shrill demands of a daughter-in-law who viewed me as a disposable obstacle. The walls no longer absorbed the pathetic, arrogant lies of a son who believed he could steal my life's work without facing the federal consequences. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of their boundless entitlement had been completely eradicated by the sheer force of the United States justice system. I walked through the empty, formal dining room and into the expansive living quarters, observing the physical void left behind by their catastrophic ambition. I did not feel any sense of loss while touring the vacant architecture. I realized that removing the parasitic elements from my environment was not an act of destruction, but an act of profound preservation. The estate was finally clean. Bradley arrived precisely at noon, carrying a sleek leather briefcase containing the final binding legal instruments. We bypassed my former guest wing and set up a temporary workspace on a simple folding table directly in the center of the empty grand ballroom. Bradley unclasped his briefcase and meticulously arranged a thick stack of certified corporate trust documents before me. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen, nodding with absolute professional respect. I did not intend to sell this multi-million-dollar property to another wealthy family or liquidate the land for commercial development. I leaned over the table and signed my name across the master transfer deed, legally donating the entire $10 million estate to a highly specialized municipal nonprofit organization. I specifically selected a foundation dedicated to teaching advanced financial literacy, commercial logistics, and rigorous business ethics to young African-American entrepreneurs. 40 years ago, I built my commercial trucking fleet while actively fighting against ruthless systemic banking discrimination and predatory lending practices. I survived those brutal decades because I maintained immaculate ledgers and refused to compromise my integrity. My son had possessed every conceivable advantage and chose to become a common corporate embezzler. I determined that the physical structure which had incubated his massive greed would now be systematically transformed into a classroom for uncompromising integrity. The sprawling bedrooms would become student dormitories, and the massive executive offices would host intensive seminars on corporate compliance and federal tax law. I handed the fully executed transfer deed back to my attorney, finalizing the irrevocable donation. The foundation would immediately take possession of the grounds, utilizing my former fortress to actively train the next generation of resilient, ethical business leaders. My wealth would no longer finance arrogance. It would fund genuine structural empowerment. With the corporate transfer entirely finalized and the legal perimeter permanently secured, I prepared to leave the city limits. I walked up the grand staircase one final time and retrieved the exact same canvas duffel bag Courtney had callously packed for me on the night of my eviction. I packed a few tailored suits, my secure digital tablets, and the encrypted biometric hardware tokens that controlled my international logistics empire. I did not require moving trucks or a massive relocation crew. I walked out of the heavy oak doors, handed the master keys directly to Bradley, and climbed into the back seat of my waiting vehicle. I instructed my driver to head toward the rugged, picturesque coastline situated 4 hours away from the toxic noise of the metropolitan financial district. I had discreetly purchased a modest, heavily fortified, sunlit home perched directly on a high ocean bluff. The architecture was entirely modern, efficient, and devoid of the sprawling, unnecessary excess that had poisoned the mansion. I arrived at my new coastal residence just as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon. The interior spaces were flooded with natural light, featuring clean lines and unobstructed views of the crashing waves below. I set up my command center in a streamlined home office facing the water. Through my encrypted global terminals, I maintained absolute, undisputed executive control over my commercial trucking fleets, my international shipping routes, and my corporate holding trusts. I managed my multi-million-dollar empire remotely with lethal efficiency, entirely insulated from the parasitic demands of ungrateful relatives. The transition was seamless and profoundly liberating. I traded a giant, miserable fortress for a quiet, impenetrable sanctuary. The following morning, I woke up naturally unbothered by frantic text messages or the fabricated emergencies of a failing software company. I brewed a pot of bitter black coffee and walked out onto my expansive wooden balcony. The cold, salty ocean breeze hit my face, carrying the sharp metallic scent of the distant commercial harbor. I stood at the railing and watched massive steel freight ships navigate the deep shipping channels, moving thousands of tons of global cargo with silent, unstoppable momentum. Those distant vessels served as a perfect reflection of my own meticulously constructed life. They operated with absolute discipline, refusing to deviate from their assigned routes, regardless of the turbulent weather crashing against their hulls. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute silence of my new environment. I reflected on the brutal, necessary reality of enforcing ironclad personal boundaries. Permitting extreme disrespect in the name of familial loyalty is not an act of love, it is an act of self-destruction. Brandon and Courtney chose to test the structural integrity of my patience, and they were utterly crushed by the weight of their own monumental greed. I had not destroyed my family. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed the strict rules of the federal justice system to orchestrate their inevitable downfall. I successfully reclaimed my vast financial wealth, my personal dignity, and the unburdened trajectory of my future. The suffocating noise of their entitlement was permanently locked behind the heavy steel doors of a federal penitentiary. I watched a massive freighter cut smoothly through the dark ocean waves heading toward the open sea. My perimeter was secure. Order was perfectly and permanently restored.